Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening here with me. If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate your subscription, like, and comment. It only takes a second for you, but it means the world to me and helps make each video even better. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. It is commonly believed that Cuba became a revolutionary country in 1959, when bearded partisans descended from the Sierra Maestra mountains and entered Havana. But long before that, a century before Fidel Castro, the island was already a place where utopias were born and died with frightening regularity. Why did this particular scrap of land in the middle of the Caribbean become a point of collision for empires, ideologies, and dreams? Why has everyone who tried to remake Cuba in their own image eventually found themselves changed by it? What makes this island, stretched in a narrow strip between the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, so uncomfortable for any master Spanish, American, or Soviet? And is it even possible to understand the history of the 20th century without knowing what happened on these shores? To answer, we must go back very far, to those times when there were no sugar plantations on Cuba, no fortresses, no ports, when the island did not yet have a name recorded on European maps, when its only inhabitants were people about whom we know strikingly little, even though they lived here for thousands of years. Imagine an early morning on the northern coast of the island. The air is thick and warm, smelling of salt and decaying seaweed. Mangroves stretch along the shore, tree roots reaching into the murky water, and small fish and crabs scurry within the tangle of those roots. Further from the shore are low hills covered in tropical forest of such density that sunlight barely breaks through the canopy. Somewhere deep within the island, the cry of a parrot is heard. The silence here is special, not empty, but filled with the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, and the distant sound of the surf. The first people appeared in Cuba approximately 6,000 years before our era. They came, most likely, from the Yucatan Peninsula or from the coast of present-day Venezuela, crossing the straits in primitive boats. Archaeologists call them the Guanajuato, though this name was given later, and we do not know what they called themselves. They were hunters and gatherers who lived in small groups. They did not build permanent settlements, and did not engage in agriculture. Their world was simple and enclosed. The shore, the forest, the water, mollusk shells, fish bones, stone scrapers. That is almost all that remains of them in the layers of the earth. Later, about 1,000 years before the arrival of the Europeans, other peoples began to arrive in Cuba, the Siboney and the Tono. The Tono were part of a larger Arawakan language family that settled throughout the islands of the Caribbean basin. They brought with them agriculture, ceramics, and a more complex social organization. Their villages were called Ucaex, and each was governed by a chief, a cacique. The Tono grew cassava, maize, sweet potatoes, and tobacco. They slept in hammocks, and the word hammock itself came into European languages, specifically from the Tono. They played ball on specially cleared areas called baitais, and this game had not only recreational, but also ritual significance. The world of the Tono was not idyllic. From the south, from the Lesser Antilles, they were periodically raided by the Caribs, a warlike people who gave their name to the entire region. The Caribs were skilled seafarers, and their appearance on the horizon meant danger. But for the Tono in Cuba, separated from the main routes of Carib raids, life was relatively peaceful. The island was large enough to feed everyone. There were enough rivers, enough fish, and the climate allowed for harvesting several times a year. Then came the year 1492, and the Tono world, which had existed for millennia, began to collapse with unimaginable speed. Christopher Columbus saw Cuba on October 28, 1492. During his first voyage, he approached the northeastern coast and recorded in his diary that it was the most beautiful land that human eyes had ever seen. Columbus was convinced that he had found the coast of Asia, perhaps the outskirts of China or Japan. He was looking for gold, spices, and the Great Khan. Instead, he found fishing villages, people adorned with small gold pendants, and tobacco, a plant the existence of which Europe did not suspect. Columbus did not stay in Cuba for long. He sailed further to Hispaniola, where he founded the first European settlement in the New World. But he returned to the shores of Cuba during his second voyage in 1494, and even forced his companions to sign a document certifying that Cuba was a peninsula, part of the Asian mainland, and not an island. This was one of the first documented attempts to impose a convenient version upon reality, a practice that would repeat itself in Cuba many more times. Real colonization began later. In 1511, Diego Velázquez de Cuellar, an experienced conquistador who had already been to Hispaniola, received orders to conquer and settle Cuba. He set out with a detachment of about 300 men and began the systematic subjugation of the island. He was aided by the fact that the Tano had neither metal weapons, nor horses, nor experience in war with an enemy so different from everything they knew. But it would be a mistake to think that the Tano surrendered without resistance. One of the first figures of Cuban resistance was the cacique Hatchery, who fled to Cuba from Hispaniola, having already seen what the Spaniards were doing to the local population. Hatchery warned the Cuban Tano about what awaited them. According to the Chronicle of Bartolomé de las Casas, Hatchery showed his tribesmen a basket of gold, and said that this was the god of the Spaniards. It was for this that they had come, and that one must either flee from them or fight. He organized a guerrilla resistance but was captured and sentenced to be burned at the stake. Before the execution, as Las Casas recorded, a Spanish monk offered Hatchery baptism so that he could go to heaven. Hatchery asked if Spaniards went there. When answered in the affirmative, he refused, saying he did not want to be in a place where there were such cruel people. This story, perhaps embellished, became the first myth of Cuban resistance long before any revolutions. Hatchery remains a symbol to this day. His name is borne by a popular brand of Cuban beer. The conquest of Cuba took only a few years. By 1515, Velázquez had founded the first 7 towns, villas, which became the strongholds of Spanish power. Among them were Baracoa, Santiago de Cuba, Trinidad, and San Cristobal de la Habana, the future Havana. Each town received its own municipal council, a cabildo, a church, and a plaza. The Spanish colonial machine worked according to a well-oiled scheme: the seizure of territory, the distribution of land and labor among the colonists through the encomienda system, the conversion of the local population to Christianity, often forced, and the extraction of resources. The encomienda system meant that a certain number of Indians were entrusted to a specific Spanish colonist. Formally, he was supposed to care for them and teach them the Christian faith. In practice, it was forced exploitation, little different from slavery. The Tano were forced to work in gold mines, in the fields, and on construction. Conditions were monstrous, but the main killer was not violence, but disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. All these diseases were unfamiliar to the population of the New World, who had no immunity to them. Epidemics spread with terrifying speed. According to various estimates, by the middle of the 16th century, the indigenous population of Cuba had decreased by 90 to 95%. Of several 100,000 people, only a few thousand remained. A whole world, a whole civilization with its own languages, myths, knowledge, songs, and conceptions of the universe disappeared in 1 or 2 generations. This was not a purposeful destruction in the modern sense of the word, but the result proved no less catastrophic. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican monk who became one of the first European defenders of the rights of indigenous peoples, described in detail what he saw in the Caribbean basin. His brief account of the destruction of the Indies, published in 1552, contains gruesome descriptions of cruelty, including mass murders and torture. Las Casas lived part of his life in Cuba and witnessed the destruction of its original population. His works influenced the adoption of the new laws of 1542, which formally forbade the enslavement of Indians, but by that point, there was almost no one left in Cuba to forbid it for. The disappearance of the indigenous population created a problem. the solution to which defined the history of Cuba for centuries to come. The colonists needed labor, and they turned to Africa. The first African slaves were brought to Cuba as early as the 1520s. At first, there were few of them. Cuba in the first half of the 16th century remained a relatively poor and sparsely populated colony. The gold that the Spaniards sought so desperately was found here in small quantities, and soon the conquistadors rushed to richer lands in Mexico and Peru. Herncourts sailed from Santiago de Cuba in 1519 to conquer the Aztec Empire. Cuba became a transit point, a place from which expeditions departed into the interior of the continent, but where few wanted to return. However, geography saved Cuba from oblivion. The island was located at the intersection of sea routes between Spain and its American colonies. Havana, thanks to its magnificent natural bay, became a key port. The Spanish trade system, the Carrera de Indias, mandated that all merchant vessels from the colonies gather in Havana. Before the return voyage to Spain, convoys loaded with silver from Mexico and Peru, gold, precious stones, spices, and other goods passed through Havana's port annually. This turned the city into one of the most important and wealthiest ports of the New World. And where there is wealth, there are predators. The Caribbean Sea in the 16th and 17th centuries was an arena of unceasing struggle between European powers. French, English, and Dutch privateers and pirates hunted the Spanish convoys. Havana was repeatedly subjected to attacks. In 1555, the French corsair Jacques de Sores captured and plundered the city, burning it to the ground. The Spaniards learned their lesson. The construction of powerful fortresses began. Castillo de la Real Fuerza, El Morro, La Punta, which turned Havana into one of the most protected harbors of the New World. Their walls, built from local coral limestone, stand to this day. Life in colonial Cuba in the 16th and the first half of the 17th century was a life on the periphery of the empire. The main riches flowed past, through the port, but without staying on the island. The economy was modest. Cattle ranching, tobacco cultivation, a little sugar cane, small farms. The population grew slowly. Spanish colonists, free mulattoes, a small number of slaves, the remnants of the indigenous population, all this mixed into a bizarre social mosaic, where the official racial hierarchy was constantly undermined by the reality of everyday life. Tobacco became Cuba's first real export commodity. The Tano had already begun to grow it, and the Spaniards quickly appreciated the commercial potential of this plant. Cuban tobacco was considered the best in the world, and this reputation persists to this day. Small tobacco farms, Vegas, appeared throughout the west of the island, especially in the province of Pinar del Rio. The tobacco growers, vegueros, were free farmers, often not wealthy, but independent. Their relations with colonial authorities were not simple. The Spanish crown repeatedly tried to establish a monopoly on tobacco, and the vegueros resisted. But the true transformation of Cuba was still ahead. It was connected with another plant, sugarcane, and with a different scale of human suffering. Sugarcane had been grown in Cuba since the 16th century, but until a certain point, the island remained a secondary producer. The main supplier of sugar in the Caribbean was Haiti, more precisely, Saint Domingue, the western part of Hispaniola, which was a French colony. And here, history takes one of its sharp turns. In 1791, a slave revolt began in Saint Domingue, the largest in the history of the New World. It grew into a full-scale revolution that, by 1804, led to the creation of Haiti, the world's first republic founded by former slaves. For the global sugar market, however, this meant catastrophe. The largest producer had dropped out of the game. Saint Domingue's plantations were destroyed, sugar mills burned, and Cuba filled the vacuum. A sugar boom began, changing the island beyond recognition. But before diving into the era of sugar, it's worth stopping at an event that was a shock in its own right. In 1762, at the height of the 7 Years' War, the British fleet attacked Havana. The siege lasted 2 months. El Morro Castle, considered impregnable, fell after the English dug a tunnel and blew up part of the wall. The British occupied Havana and held it for 11 months. This short period of British occupation left a mark disproportionate to its duration. The English opened the port of Havana to free trade, something the Spanish monopoly had never allowed. In those 11 months, more merchant ships passed through Havana than in the previous years combined. Cuban planters got their first taste of economic freedom and saw how much could be earned without the restrictions of the Spanish mercantile system. Additionally, during the occupation, about 10,000 African slaves were brought to the island, more than in all previous years combined. Under the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Spain regained Havana in exchange for Florida. But the seeds of change were sown. The Cuban Criollo elite, descendants of Spaniards born on the island, realized that their interests did not align with those of the metropole. They wanted to trade freely, they wanted to expand plantations, and they wanted more slaves. The Spanish crown, shocked by the loss of Havana, began reforms. Some trade restrictions were loosened, new fortifications built, and the military garrison increased. Cuba received more administrative autonomy, but most importantly, the doors to the slave trade were opened wider. Now, back to sugar. In the final decades of the 18th century and the first decades of the 19th, Cuba underwent a true sugar revolution. Forests were cleared to make room for cane plantations. New technologies, steam engines, improved presses, and vacuum pans for evaporation increased productivity, while the labor force consisted of hundreds of thousands of Africans, brought across the Atlantic in chains. The scale of the slave trade in Cuba during this period is staggering. By various estimates, from the late 18th century until the final ban on the slave trade in 1867, between 700,000 and over 1 million African slaves were imported. Cuba became the last major slave market in the Western Hemisphere, continuing to import captives long after Great Britain and the United States had formally banned the transatlantic slave trade. Life for a slave on a sugar plantation was a nightmare. The workday lasted from 16 to 20 hours during the zafra, the cane harvesting season. The temperature in the Casa de Calderas, the boiling house, was unbearable. Injuries from machinery were common. Arms were caught in presses, and burns from boiling soap-covered bodies. The average life expectancy of a slave on a sugar plantation was, by some accounts, only 7 years after arriving on the island. It was literally murderous work, and planters viewed slaves as expendable material. It was cheaper to buy new ones than to create conditions for the survival of those they had. Yet even in this hell, people found ways to resist. Escapes were constant. Runaway slaves, known as cimarrones, fled to the mountains and swamps, creating hidden settlements called palenques. Some of these communities existed for decades, leading a semi-guerrilla life. Uprisings also occurred, bursts of despair and anger that were brutally suppressed. One of the largest took place in 1812 in Matanzas province, when slaves and free blacks revolted. Inspired by the example of the Haitian Revolution, the conspiracy was discovered, followed by mass executions. Resistance took other forms as well. Africans brought from different regions, Yoruba, Congo, Caribou, Lucan, brought their religions, music, dances, and languages. These cultural traditions did not disappear, but were transformed, blending with elements of Catholicism and local customs. Thus arose Santeria, a syncretic religion in which African deities or rishis were identified with Catholic saints. Chongo became Saint Barbara, Yemaya became the Virgin of Regla, and Obatola became the Virgin of Mercy. This was not just religious blending but a survival strategy. Slaves could worship their gods under the guise of honoring Christian saints. The rhythms of African drums, the bat, formed the basis of what would later become Cuban music. Rumba, son, mambo, cha-cha-cha. All these genres, which conquered the world in the 20th century, carry the genetic memory of African rituals and plantation songs. Cuba, as we know it today, with its music, dance, and characteristic energy, was created not only by Spanish colonists but, to no lesser extent, by Africans who arrived here against their will. By the middle of the 19th century, Cuba was one of the richest colonies in the world and one of the most brutal. Sugar was the backbone of the economy. The island produced a significant share of the world's sugar. The Havana elite lived in luxury comparable to that of Europe. Magnificent palaces, theaters, botanical gardens, and a university. The first railroad in Cuba was built in 1837, earlier than in Spain itself. It connected Havana with the sugar districts of giants, and its sole purpose was the transportation of sugar. But this wealth stood on a foundation of slavery, and that foundation was cracking. By the mid-19th century, the world was changing. Slavery was being abolished, one by one, in the colonies of European powers. Great Britain freed slaves in its Caribbean possessions in 1834, France in 1848. In the United States, the conflict between the slave-holding South and the free North was intensifying, soon to boil over into a civil war. International pressure on Spain increased, but Cuban planters clung to slavery. It was the basis of their prosperity. Simultaneously, dissatisfaction with the Spanish colonial regime grew among Cuban criollos. Taxes were high, trade restrictions burdensome, and Cuban participation in the management of their own island was minimal. Spain treated Cuba like a cash cow, squeezing revenue from it and giving nothing in return. However, the desire for independence faced a paradox. Many planters feared that separation from Spain would lead to the abolition of slavery and, as a consequence, a second Haitian uprising of the black majority. This fear of the Africanization of Cuba was one of the main brakes on the liberation movement. It also explains why part of the Cuban elite, especially in the west of the island, around Havana and Matanzas, where the largest plantations were located, preferred annexation by the United States, specifically the slave-holding United States, where slavery would be preserved. The idea of annexing Cuba to the U.S. had a long history. Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy Adams viewed the island as a natural extension of American territory. In 1823, Adams formulated the ripe fruit doctrine. Cuba, like a fruit that will eventually fall from the tree, would inevitably pass to the United States. In the 1850s, President Franklin Pierce offered to buy Cuba from Spain for $130 million. Spain refused. Several expeditions of American adventurers, or filibusters, tried to seize the island by force. The most famous was organized by Narciso Lopez, a Venezuelan who dreamed of joining Cuba to the States. He landed on the island twice and failed twice. During the second attempt in 1851, he was captured and executed by Spanish authorities. But Cuba did not become American. The Civil War in the States, 1861–65, and the subsequent abolition of slavery, stripped the annexationist project of its main appeal for Cuban planters. Now that the United States was a free country, joining it no longer guaranteed the preservation of slave ownership. The Cuban elite found themselves at a dead end. The eastern part of the island, the Oriente, was different. Here, plantations were smaller, the economy more diverse, slaves proportionally fewer, and ties with Spain weaker. It was here, in 1868, that the revolution broke out. On October 10, 1868, Carlos Manuel de Cespedes, a lawyer and planter from Oriente, issued the Grito de Llora, a declaration of Cuban independence from Spain. Simultaneously, he freed his slaves and called on them to join the struggle. This gesture was both noble and pragmatic. Cespedes understood that, without the support of the black population, the revolution was doomed. Thus began the 10 Years' War, Cuba's first major attempt to gain independence. It lasted from 1868 to 1878 and became one of the bloodiest conflicts in Caribbean history. The Mon rebels waged guerrilla warfare in the mountains and forests of eastern Cuba. Among them were white criollos, free mulattoes, and black former slaves. The war quickly acquired a racial dimension. Black fighters made up a significant portion of the rebel forces, and many rose to high ranks. Antonio Maceo, a mulatto from Santiago de Cuba, became one of the most outstanding military leaders. He was nicknamed the Bronze Titan for his fearlessness in battle and unbending will. However, the rebels suffered from internal contradictions. Western planters never joined the uprising, fearing the loss of property and racial war. Constant disputes over strategy, power, and inevitably race and slavery occurred between the civilian government of the Republic in arms and the military commanders. The question of slave abolition split the rebel movement. Radicals demanded immediate and total liberation, while moderates proposed a gradual approach, fearing they would alienate slaveholders. Spain, for its part, threw significant forces into suppressing the uprising. At its peak, more than 100,000 Spanish soldiers participated in the Cuban War, an unprecedented military presence. For a colonial conflict of that time, the Spaniards employed scorched earth tactics and concentration camps long before this method became associated with the Boer War and the 20th century, along with mass repressions against the civilian population. The war ended with the Pact of Zanji in 1878, an agreement that effectively recognized the defeat of the rebels. Cuba remained a Spanish colony. The promised reforms were minimal. Slavery formally persisted, although a law for gradual emancipation was passed in 1880. By 1886, slavery in Cuba was finally abolished, the last of all colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Even after Brazil, which had ended slavery in 1888, but not everyone accepted defeat. Antonio Maceo refused to sign the Pact of Zanji in a famous gesture known as the Protest of Brogu. He declared that he would not lay down his arms until Cuba became free, and until slavery was completely abolished. Maceo was forced into exile, but his protest became a symbol of intransigence that inspired subsequent generations. 17 years passed between the 10 Years' War and the next major uprising. These were years of profound change. Slavery was abolished, but former slaves found themselves at the bottom of the social ladder, without land, without education, without rights. The sugar industry was experiencing a crisis. Competition from beet sugar in Europe drove down prices, and many Cuban planters were ruined. Foreign capital, primarily American, began buying up Cuban land and sugar mills. Economic dependence on the United States was growing. It was during these years that a man stepped onto the center stage, who would become the main architect of Cuban independence and one of the most revered figures in Latin American history, José Martí. Martí was born in Havana in 1853 to a family of poor Spanish immigrants. At only 16, he was arrested for sympathizing with the rebels of the 10 Years' War and sentenced to hard labor. Then came exile to Spain, where he received a legal and philosophical education. This was followed by wanderings through Latin America, living in Mexico, Guatemala, Venezuela and finally, New York, where he spent most of the 1880s and 90s working as a journalist, poet, diplomatic representative, and, most importantly, the organizer of the future revolution. Martí was not just a political figure, he was a thinker, a visionary, and one of the greatest Latin American writers. His prose, his poetry, his essays all were imbued with the ideas of freedom, justice, and human dignity. But Martí was also a practical man. He worked tirelessly to create the Cuban Revolutionary Party, raised funds among Cuban immigrants, including tobacco workers in Florida, and established ties with military chiefs on the island. One of Martí's key ideas deserves special attention. He categorically opposed racism and insisted that a free Cuba must be a state for everyone: whites, blacks, and mulattoes. A Cuban is more than white, more than mulatto, more than black, he wrote. Martí saw unity as the prerequisite for a Cuban nation. He also warned of the danger of American imperialism, seeing from New York how the United States was increasing its economic and political influence in the region. He wrote, "I have lived in the belly of the beast and I know it from the inside." On February 24, 1895, a new war for independence began. Martí, who had coordinated the uprising from exile, landed in Cuba in April alongside General Máximo Gómez. On May 19, in one of the first combat encounters at Dos Rios, Martí was killed. He was 42 years old. He transformed into a martyr and the most powerful symbol of the Cuban liberation movement, a figure who would subsequently be used by everyone, from liberals to communists, from anarchists to nationalists. The war continued without Martí. Antonio Maceo led the struggle in the west, while Máximo Gómez led in the east. The rebels employed a total war strategy. They burned sugar plantations and destroyed infrastructure, attempting to make Cuba economically unviable for Spain. Spain responded with even harsher measures. General Valeriano Weyler, appointed governor of Cuba in 1896, was the author of the reconcentracing policy. The rural population was driven into fortified towns and camps to deprive the rebels of support. Conditions in these camps were horrific: hunger, disease, and death. According to various estimates, between 100,000 and 300,000 Cuban civilians died from the reconcentracing policy. These figures caused horror, even by 19th century standards, and became one of the first instances where the mass suffering of a civilian population was widely covered by the press and influenced international public opinion. It was the press, primarily the American press, that played a key role in what happened next. Newspaper magnates William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were waging a circulation war, and the Cuban conflict became ideal material for sensationalism. The yellow press published heartbreaking stories of Spanish atrocities, often exaggerated, sometimes invented, but invariably impactful. American public opinion shifted more and more toward supporting the Cuban rebels. Then an incident occurred that served as the pretext for direct intervention. On February 15, 1898, the American battleship Maine, sent to Havana harbor ostensibly to protect American citizens and interests, exploded. 266 sailors died. The cause of the explosion was never established with complete certainty. According to most modern researchers, an internal coal bunker explosion was more likely than a Spanish mine. But in 1898, that did not matter. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. This slogan filled the newspaper pages. In April 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War, a splendid little war, as the future Secretary of State John Hay called it, lasted less than 4 months. American troops landed in Cuba, at Santiago de Cuba, and, supported by Cuban rebels, quickly defeated the demoralized Spanish garrison. The Battle of San Juan Hill, in which Theodore Roosevelt distinguished himself with his Rough Riders, became one of the textbook episodes of American military mythology. But here is what is telling. When Spain capitulated, the Cuban rebels were not allowed into the armistice signing ceremony. They were excluded from the negotiations. The peace treaty was signed in Paris in December 1898 between Spain and the United States. Cuba was not even invited to the table. The island, for whose freedom Cubans had fought for 30 years, was handed from the hands of one empire into the hands of another without their participation. This was a bitter irony, and it defined Cuba's political psychology for the next century. The United States occupied Cuba from 1898 to 1902. The military government under General Leonard Wood carried out a series of reforms, reorganized the education system, improved sanitary conditions, and built roads. The fight against yellow fever, involving the Cuban Dr. Carlos Finley, who correctly identified mosquitoes as the carriers of the disease, became one of the significant achievements of this period. But the key document that defined Cuba's fate for a half-century was the so-called Platt Amendment. The United States Congress passed it in 1901 and demanded that it be included in the Cuban Constitution as a condition for the withdrawal of American troops. The amendment gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban internal affairs for the preservation of life, property, and individual liberty. It prohibited Cuba from concluding treaties with third countries that threatened its independence, and obligated it to provide the U.S. with naval bases. Thus appeared the Guantanamo Bay base, which exists to this day. The Cuban delegates to the Constitutional Convention accepted the Platt Amendment reluctantly, Under pressure, and with a minimal majority of votes, they understood that the alternative was a continuation of the occupation. It was a forced consent, and the bitterness from it did not dissipate. On May 20, 1902, the Republic of Cuba was proclaimed. The first president was Tomás Estrada Palma, a former participant in the 10 Years' War who had lived in exile for a long time. Formally, Cuba became independent. In practice, it was a semi-sovereign state whose independence was limited by the will of its northern neighbor. The first decade of the Republica period that Cuban historians often call the pseudo-republic, or the neo-colonial republic, was a time of instability, corruption, and growing American dominance. The United States introduced troops into Cuba 3 times in 1906, 1912, and 1917 using the Platt Amendment as a legal justification. American capital seized the Cuban economy. By the 1920s, American companies controlled 2/3 of the island's sugar industry, a significant portion of the railroads, telephone and electrical networks, and the mining industry. Cuba became a classic example of economic neocolonialism, formally independent, but effectively managed by foreign capital. Sugar continued to dominate. Cuba's economy was tragically monocultural. When sugar prices were high, as during World War I when they skyrocketed, the island flourished when prices fell, as in 1921 when the sugar bubble burst. Catastrophe struck. This year entered Cuban history as the dance of the millions, a period of dizzying boom, followed by an equally dizzying crash. Banks were ruined, farmers lost land, and unemployment rose. The social structure of Cuba in the first half of the 20th century was complex and contradictory. Racial inequality persisted, despite the official rhetoric of equality. Blacks and mulattoes made up between 1/4 and 1/3 of the population, but were excluded from the political and economic elite. In 1912, a black uprising led by the Independent Party of Color was suppressed with monstrous cruelty. According to various estimates, several thousand people died. This event long suppressed an independent political movement of black Cubans. At the same time, Cuban culture pulsed with energy. Havana in the 1920s and 30s was one of the most vibrant cities in the world. Music, dance, theater, literature, all of this flourished. Son Cubano, a musical genre that combined African rhythms with Spanish melodic traditions, was conquering the world. Musicians, writers, and artists from all over Latin America and Europe came to Havana. Nightclubs, cabarets, casinos, the tropical Monte Carlo, as the city was called. But poverty and disenfranchisement hid behind the glitter. Most Cubans, especially in rural areas, lived in poverty. Illiteracy was high, medical care inaccessible, and land was concentrated in the hands of a few. Social contrasts were glaring. In Havana, shop windows sparkled and neon signs of casinos flashed. Meanwhile, in the barrios, the thatched huts of the interior provinces, families went hungry. In this environment, a powerful student movement emerged in Cuba in the 1920s. Trade unions and left-wing political organizations appeared. The Communist Party of Cuba was founded in 1925. Cuban intellectuals, poets, artists, and journalists searched for a Cuban national identity, turning to African heritage, the history of the struggle for independence, and the image of José. The key figure of this period was Gerardo Machado, a president elected in 1925 with promises of reform and modernization. At first, he indeed took a number of useful steps, the construction of the Central Highway and the development of infrastructure. But very soon, Machado turned into a dictator. He extended his presidential term, suppressed the opposition, and arrested and killed political opponents. His secret police inspired terror. Student leaders disappeared. Trade union activists were found dead. Machado ruled with an iron fist, relying on the army and indirectly on the support of the United States, which was satisfied with stability, even if achieved through repression. But in 1933, against the backdrop of the Great Depression, which crashed world sugar prices and plunged Cuban economy into chaos. Patience ran out. A general strike paralyzed the island. The army withdrew its support from Machado. On August 12, 1933, the dictator fled the country, loading several suitcases of gold into his plane. Havana exploded in violence. The homes of his supporters were ransacked, police officers were lynched, and prisons were opened. What followed was one of the most turbulent and complex periods of Cuban history. Within a few months, several governments changed. In September 1933, a group of sergeants and soldiers, uniting with student leaders, carried out the so-called Sergeants' Revolt. Among its organizers, a young sergeant stenographer named Fulgencio Batista y Zorva stood out. Batista. This name would echo in Cuban history for another quarter of a century. A man of mixed origin, Spanish, African, probably Indian, who grew up in poverty, received no formal education, and made a career in the army. Batista became the key figure of Cuban politics, manipulating presidents and governments from behind the scenes, and later stepping into the center stage. After the Sergeants' Revolt, the reformist government of Raúl San Martín, a university professor who enjoyed the support of students and the left, came to power for a long period. Grau carried out a series of radical reforms: an 8-hour workday, a minimum wage, the right for women to vote, and the abolition of the Platt Amendment. But his government lasted only 127 days. The United States refused to recognize it. Batista withdrew the support of the army. In January 1934, Grau left, and Batista became the de facto ruler of Cuba. Formally, the Platt Amendment was abolished in 1934. This was one of the achievements of Grau's government. The United States gave up the right to direct military intervention, but economic dependence remained. A new trade treaty consolidated the privileged position of American goods in the Cuban market, and guaranteed Cuba a quota for sugar exports to the States. The stick was replaced by the carrot, but the essence of the relationship changed little. Batista ruled Cuba, first through puppet presidents, then as an elected president in 184,044 with varying success. He proved to be a pragmatist rather than an ideologue. He flirted with the left when it was advantageous. The 1940 Constitution, adopted during his rule, was one of the most progressive in Latin America. It included broad social guarantees, workers' rights, and the secular nature of the state. Batista even collaborated with the communists, to members of the People's Socialist Party, as the Cuban Communists were called, joined his government. But Batista was also corrupt, unprincipled, and cruel when he deemed it necessary. His first period in power, however, was relatively moderate. In 1944, he lost the election and peacefully ceded power. This was a rare moment of democratic normalcy in Cuban history. The subsequent two presidents, Raúl San Martín, who returned to power through elections, and Carlos Prosocars, represented the Partido Auténtico Cuban Revolutionary Party. Their rule was marked by some social reforms, but above all by a staggering level of corruption. The embezzlement of state funds became the norm. Gangster groups linked to political parties operated openly in Havana. Violence in the streets, political assassinations, and graft. All this undermined Cubans' faith in democracy and their own institutions. It was during this era that Havana became what the world remembers it as: a city of casinos, brothels, and the mafia. American organized crime, primarily Mayalanski, the mob's accountant, and his partners, invested in Cuban casinos and nightclubs. Havana turned into a giant entertainment center for American tourists seeking what was prohibited or restricted at home: gambling, prostitution, cheap alcohol, exoticism. The Hotel Nacional, the Tropicana, the Riviera. These names became symbols of the era. And at this very same time, in 1952, Batista carried out a coup d'état. He did this on March 10, a few months before the scheduled elections in which, according to all polls, he had no chance of winning. The army supported him. President Pro fled without resistance. The 1940 constitution was abolished. Parliament was dissolved. Batista established a dictatorship that lasted almost 7 years and became, by general consensus, the worst period of his rule. Batista's second coming to power was qualitatively different. While before he had tried to at least formally observe constitutional procedures, now he ruled in an overtly authoritarian manner. Political parties were banned or marginalized, and trade unions were placed under control. The press was censored, and universities were under police supervision. The secret police and military intelligence arrested, tortured, and killed opposition members. Bodies were found on the roadsides, in vacant lots, and in ditches. At the same time, Batista continued to enjoy the support of the United States. Washington immediately recognized his government. American capital continued to flow into Cuba. The mafia continued to build casinos. The economy grew, but the growth was uneven. Its fruits went to the elite, while the rural poor continued to live in poverty. Among those who were supposed to participate in the aborted 1952 elections was a young lawyer, a candidate for congressman from the party of the Cuban People Orthodox. His name was Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. Castro was born on August 13, 1926, in Bern, in Oriente Province. His father, Angel Castro, was a Spanish immigrant who grew rich on sugar plantations. His mother, Lena Ruz, was a servant in Angel's house who became his second wife. Fidel grew up in relative prosperity, studied at prestigious Jesuit schools, and then at the law faculty of the University of Havana. The University of the 1940s was a boiling cauldron of politics. Student groups ranging from right-wing nationalists to communists fought for influence, and this struggle was often waged with weapons in hand. The young Castro quickly distinguished himself as a charismatic, ambitious, and fearless leader. Although his political views in those years were more nationalist and anti-imperialist than Marxist, Batista's coup was a moment of truth for Castro. He became convinced that the legal path to power was closed, and turned to the only remaining alternative, armed struggle. On July 26, 1953, Castro led a group of approximately 160 young people in an assault on the Moncada barracks, in Santiago de Cuba, the second largest military base on the island. The plan was adventurous to the point of recklessness: to seize the barracks, arm the population, and raise an uprising in the eastern provinces. The operation failed catastrophically. The attackers were crushed, many were killed in battle, and many were shot after capture. Castro was arrested. The trial of the Moncada assault participants became a turning point. Castro, being a lawyer, took on his own defense and delivered a speech that went down in history under the title "History Will Absolve Me." It was simultaneously an indictment against the Batista regime and a programmatic document outlining a vision for a just Cuba: agrarian reform, housing for the poor, accessible education and medicine, and the nationalization of foreign monopolies. Castro was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Castro spent less than 2 years in the prison on the Isle of Pines. In 1955, Batista, demonstrating a showy liberalization, declared an amnesty. Castro was released and went to Mexico, where he began preparing for a new attempt. It was in Mexico that a meeting took place that changed the course of history. Castro met an Argentinian doctor, Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, whom his friends called Che. Guevara was an idealist, a well-read Marxist, and an adventurer who had already traveled through several Latin American countries and witnessed the CIA-organized coup in Guatemala in 1954. He was more radical than Castro and more convinced of the need for a socialist revolution. Their union proved to be one of the most influential political partnerships of the 20th century. In Mexico, Castro created the July 26 movement, a revolutionary organization named after the Moncada assault. He gathered a group of 82 people, acquired the yacht Granma, and on November 25, 1956, set sail for the shores of Cuba. The landing was a disaster. The yacht, designed for 12 people, was hopelessly overloaded. The voyage across the Gulf of Mexico was accompanied by storms, seasickness, and delays. Instead of the planned location, the rebels landed in a swampy area on the coast of Oriente. They were discovered by government troops and scattered. Out of the 82 men, by various estimates, between 12 and 20 were able to escape into the Sierra Maestra mountains. Among the survivors were Fidel, his brother Raúl, Che Guevara, and several close associates. Batista announced that Castro had been killed. This was a mistake one of many the dictator made in the subsequent years. A handful of rebels in the Sierra Maestra mountains. How did this handful of people turn into a force capable of toppling a government? The answer lies not only in military action, but also in politics, psychology, and the moral decay of the Batista regime. The Sierra Maestra is Cuba's highest mountain range, rugged, inaccessible, and covered in dense tropical forest. The local peasants, the Guajiros, lived here in poverty, without schools, hospitals, or roads. The rebels found support and recruits among them. Castro established strict discipline. Looting was punished. Treatment of the peasants had to be respectful. Prisoners were not to be shot. This stood in stark contrast to the behavior of government troops, who often plundered and terrorized the civilian population. The rebel army grew slowly. In the early months, its actions were more symbolic. Small skirmishes, ambushes, and the seizure of minor garrisons. But every small victory was magnified by propaganda, and every defeat of the government forces demoralized Batista's army. The press played a key role. New York Times journalist Herbert Matthews managed to penetrate the Sierra Maestra in February 1957, and published a series of interviews with Castro, proving to the world that he was alive and active. Castro appeared as a romantic hero, young, eloquent, and fighting for freedom against tyranny. Parallel to the guerrilla war in the mountains, the urban underground gained strength. The July 26 movement had an extensive network in the cities, primarily in Havana and Santiago. Underground fighters committed acts of sabotage, organized strikes, and distributed leaflets. The student movement played a special role, notably the Revolutionary Directorate, led by José Antonio Echeverría. On March 13, 1957, a group of students stormed the presidential palace in an attempt to assassinate Batista. The attack failed. Echeverría and many others died. Meanwhile, the Batista regime was rotting from within. Corruption reached monstrous proportions. Generals and colonels enriched themselves, and officers traded in weapons. The police were engaged in racketeering. The army was demoralized. Soldiers did not want to fight an invisible enemy in the mountains to protect a regime to which they felt no loyalty. The middle class, business leaders, and even part of the army command began to turn away from Batista. The United States also began to shift its position. In 1958, Washington imposed an arms embargo on Batista, late and a half-hearted gesture, but symbolically important. American diplomats tried to find a third force, a moderate alternative to both Batista and Castro, but these attempts were unsuccessful. In the summer of 1958, Batista launched his last major offensive, Operation Verano, with the aim of destroying the rebels in the Sierra Maestra. Approximately 10,000 soldiers were thrown against a few hundred guerrillas. The operation failed. The rebels crushed government columns in a series of battles, using their knowledge of the terrain and high morale. This was the turning point. After this, the rebel army went on the offensive. Two columns, one commanded by Che Guevara, the other by Camilo Cienfuegos, moved west into the central provinces. The decisive event was the Battle of Santa Clara, led by Guevara. The city was taken on December 31, 1958. After the capture of an armored train sent by Batista as a last reserve. On the night of January 1, 1959, Batista fled Cuba by plane with his family, associates, and money. He flew to the Dominican Republic to join another dictator, Rafael Trujillo, and later moved to Portugal, where he lived until his death in 1973. Havana woke up on January 1st in a strange state between euphoria and uncertainty. Batista had fled, but the rebels had not yet entered the capital. There were spontaneous acts of retribution, the homes of regime henchmen were ransacked, and parking meters, which had become a symbol of casino corruption, were smashed. There was some looting, but large-scale bloodshed was avoided. Castro, who was in Santiago de Cuba, began a slow, triumphal procession across the island, known as the Caravan of Freedom. He arrived in Havana on January 8, 1959. Crowds of people met him at every step. His speech at the Colombian military base before hundreds of thousands of people in the dark of night, when a white dove landed on his shoulder, became one of the most iconic scenes of the 20th century. "I believe we will not make a mistake," he said then. They were mistaken. Or rather, history proved more complex than it seemed that night. The first months after the revolution were a time of hope and improvisation. Formally, Manuel Arusha became president and José Cardona became prime minister. But from day one, real power belonged to Fidel Castro and his inner circle: Raúl Castro, Che Guevara, and Camilo Cienfuegos. The revolution lacked a clear ideological program. Castro spoke of democracy, social justice, and the restoration of the 1940 Constitution. He denied being a communist. At that moment, this was perhaps true. One of the first acts of the new regime was the trial of Batista's henchmen, military, and police accused of torture and murder. The trials were public, swift, and often, in a legal sense, insufficiently objective. Hundreds were sentenced to the firing squad. This sparked a wave of criticism in the United States and Europe. Castro responded that the Cuban people had the right to retribution, and organized a mass rally in Havana, where hundreds of thousands voted to continue the executions by a show of hands. In May 1959, the Agrarian Reform Law was passed, the first truly radical step of the new government. Large landholdings, including those owned by American companies, were subject to confiscation and redistribution among the peasants. The maximum size of a land plot was limited to approximately 400 hectares. This hit the most sensitive nerve: property. Cuban latifundistas and American businesses were in shock. From this moment, relations between the revolutionary government and the United States began to deteriorate rapidly. Washington demanded compensation for the confiscated property. Havana offered payments in bonds, based on the undervalued tax value of the land, effectively a refusal. Every new round of nationalization after land came oil refineries, banks, and industrial enterprises deepened the conflict. Within Cuba, contradictions were also mounting. Moderate participants in the revolution, those who dreamed of a liberal democracy, were pushed away from power. President Arusha was forced to resign in July 1959. Commander Hugo Motos, one of the war heroes, openly spoke out against communist influence and was arrested, convicted, and spent 20 years in prison. Camilo Cienfuegos, one of the most popular comandantes, died in a plane crash in October 1959 under unexplained circumstances. Many suspected Raúl Castro or Che Guevara. By the end of 1959, the revolution had radicalized. The independent press was closed or placed under control. Trade unions were purged of dissenters. Political parties, except for the July 26 movement and their allies, were pushed out. A one-party system was forming, though the party was formally created later. When exactly did Castro become a communist? It is a question historians discuss to this day. Was he a secret Marxist even in the mountains? Or did he radicalize under the pressure of circumstances, American hostility, and the need to choose a side in the Cold War? Most likely, the process was gradual. Castro moved to the left under the influence of Raúl and Guevara, who were convinced communists, as well as the logic of confrontation with Washington. If the states were the enemy, Moscow was the ally. The logic of the Cold War left no room for intermediate positions. In February 1960, Anastas Mikoyan, deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union, arrived in Cuba. The first trade agreement was signed. The USSR began buying Cuban sugar and supplying oil. This was a strategic alliance that changed the geopolitics of the entire region. The United States responded with escalation. In the spring of 1960, the CIA received authorization from President Eisenhower to prepare an operation to overthrow Castro. Cuban exiles and emigration by that point was already massive, as tens of thousands of middle and upper-class representatives had left the island. Began military training in camps in Guatemala. On January 3, 1961, Washington broke off diplomatic relations with Havana. Cuba found itself isolated from its closest and largest neighbor. 3 months later, an event occurred that finally consolidated the revolutionary regime. On April 17, 1961, about 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and armed by the CIA, landed at the Bay of Pigs Playa Girón, on the southern coast of Cuba. The operation had been planned under Eisenhower and inherited by the new president, John F. Kennedy. The calculation was that the landing would trigger a mass uprising against Castro. No uprising occurred. The invasion failed in 3 days. The Cuban armed forces and People's Militia crushed the landing force. The promised air support from the CIA proved insufficient. Kennedy cancelled key airstrikes at the last moment, fearing direct U.S. involvement. About 114 paratroopers died, the rest were captured. For Castro, the plan was a magnificent gift. The attempted invasion confirmed everything he had said about American imperialism. It united Cubans around the regime, even those who had doubts. It provided a moral basis for intensifying internal repression. Any dissenter could be declared a CIA agent, and it pushed Castro toward the decisive step. On April 16th, the eve of the invasion, he publicly declared the Cuban Revolution to be socialist for the first time. Cuba became the first and only communist state in the Western Hemisphere, 90 miles from the coast of the United States. It was unthinkable, yet it was reality. Radicalization accelerated. By the end of 1961, all large enterprises, industrial, commercial, and agricultural, had been nationalized. Private ownership of the means of production was abolished. Education became free and state-run. A mass campaign to liquidate illiteracy was conducted. In 1961, hundreds of thousands of young volunteers, the brigadistas, went to the countryside to teach peasants to read and write. The campaign was completed in a year, and upon its conclusion, Cuba declared itself a country free of illiteracy. This was a genuine achievement, recognized by international organizations. But literacy was used not only for enlightenment. The new education system became a tool for ideological training. Textbooks were rewritten, curricula were overhauled. Schools, universities, the press, television, and culture all were placed at the service of the revolutionary project. Mass emigration began. By the mid-1960s, hundreds of thousands of people had left Cuba, primarily representatives of the middle class, specialists, entrepreneurs, and intellectuals. They left for Miami, creating a Cuban community in exile that eventually became one of the most influential diasporas in the United States. For those remaining in Cuba, the emigrants became gusano swarms, traitors. For the emigrants, Castro was a tyrant who had stolen their homeland. This division, physical, emotional, and ideological, split the Cuban nation in two. The rift has not healed to this day, but before moving further, it is necessary to return to an event that put the world on the brink of nuclear war. October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the Bay of Pigs, Castro was convinced that the United States would make a new attempt at invasion, a more serious one using its own armed forces. He turned to the Soviet Union for protection. Khrushchev saw an opportunity to shift the strategic balance of power. Placing medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba would allow him to compensate for American missile superiority in Europe, where the states had already deployed Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy. In the summer of 1962, Soviet missiles, bombers, and about 42,000 Soviet military personnel began arriving in Cuba. The operation was conducted under the strictest secrecy, but on October 14, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane photographed launch sites under construction. For 13 days, from October 16 to 28, the world balanced on the edge of the abyss. Kennedy established a naval blockade of Cuba. Soviet ships carrying missiles moved toward the island. The military on both sides prepared for war. At any moment, an incident, an error, or a misunderstanding could have triggered a nuclear conflict that would have destroyed civilization. Something few people know is that tactical nuclear weapons were already in Cuba. Soviet commanders on the ground, according to some reports, had delegated authority to use them in the event of an American invasion. If Kennedy had given the order to land an option that was seriously considered, nuclear weapons could have been used against American troops. On the Cuban coast, the consequences are impossible to imagine. The crisis was resolved diplomatically. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for Kennedy's promise not to invade Cuba and, secretly, for the withdrawal of American missiles from Turkey. Castro was furious. He was not informed, he was not consulted. The decision was made behind his back. He felt like a pawn in someone else's game. And in a certain sense, he was. The Cuban Missile Crisis had long-term consequences. It frightened both superpowers and pushed them toward détente, a direct communication line between the White House and the Kremlin, a nuclear test ban treaties. But for Cuba, it meant a fixed status. The island became a Soviet ally in the Western Hemisphere, received security guarantees from the United States. Although the CIA continued attempts to assassinate Castro, and found itself firmly embedded in the Cold War system, the 1960s were a time of greatest revolutionary enthusiasm and greatest experimentation. Castro and Guevara dreamed of creating a new man, an ideal revolutionary citizen, motivated not by greed but by consciousness, ready to work for the benefit of society without material incentives. This was utopia in its purest form. And like all utopias, it collided with the reality of human nature. Economic policy lurched from one extreme to another. There was an attempt to rapidly diversify the economy and escape sugar dependency. It failed. This was followed by the ambitious plan for the 10 million ton harvests Zafra de los Días Milones. In 1970, Cuba was supposed to produce 10 million tons of sugar, breaking all records. The entire country was mobilized. Students, officials, and soldiers all went to cut cane. The goal was not achieved. They produced about 8.5 million tons, but at the cost of monstrous effort and the disruption of all other sectors of the economy. Castro publicly admitted the failure, which was a rarity. Che Guevara, by that point, was no longer in Cuba. In 1965, he left the island secretly and mysteriously, leaving a farewell letter to Castro. He went first to the Congo, where he unsuccessfully tried to ignite a revolution, then to Bolivia, where in October 1967 he was captured by the Bolivian military with CIA assistance and shot. He was 39 years old. Guevara's death turned him into an icon. The photograph taken by Alberto caught the face in the beret. The gaze fixed on the distance became one of the most reproduced images in history. Guevara the symbol eclipsed Guevara the man, the revolutionary romantic, the fighter for justice, the uncompromising idealist. The real Guevara was more complex and harsher. He personally supervised executions at the La Caba fortress after the revolution. He believed in the necessity of violence as a tool for change. His economic ideas were often detached from reality. Meanwhile, Cuba was building a system that has survived with modifications to the present day. A one-party state, a planned economy, state ownership of the means of production, free education and healthcare, and social equality, at least in theory. The achievements were real. The Cuban healthcare system became one of the best in the developing world. Infant mortality dropped to the levels of developed countries. Life expectancy increased. Literacy became practically 100%. Tens of thousands of doctors, engineers, and scientists were trained. Cuban sports boxing, track and field, baseball, volleyball achieved staggering results at the Olympic Games, disproportionate to the country's size. But the price was high. Political freedoms were suppressed, opposition was banned. The independent press was destroyed. Prisons were full of political prisoners. Thousands of people passed through the military units to aid production. Forced labor camp system, where antisocial elements were sent. Religious believers, homosexuals, people who listened to rock music, and those suspected of disloyalty. Conditions in these camps were harsh. Homosexuality was persecuted openly and systematically. This was one of the darkest pages of the Cuban Revolution. The economy depended on Soviet subsidies. The USSR bought Cuban sugar at inflated prices, supplied oil at reduced rates, and provided loans and technical assistance. This dependency was deep. By some estimates, Soviet aid amounted to several $billion annually. Cuba, having freed itself from economic dependence on the United States, found itself in an equally deep dependency on the Soviet Union. But Castro's Cuba was not just a small island nation surviving thanks to a patron. It claimed the role of a global player. And, surprisingly, in many ways, it played that role. Cuban foreign policy from the 1960s to the 1980s was unique in scale and ambition for a country of its size. Castro saw himself as a leader of the world revolution, or at least the revolution in the Third World. Cuba supported guerrilla movements in Latin America from Venezuela to Bolivia, from Colombia to Nicaragua. The results were mixed. Most attempts to export revolution to Latin America failed, but in 1979, the Sandinistas overthrew Somoza in Nicaragua, with significant Cuban support. The most striking was Cuban involvement in Africa. In 1975, when Angola gained independence from Portugal and immediately plunged into civil war, Cuba sent tens of thousands of soldiers to support the MPLA government against the UNITA rebels and invading South African troops. The Cuban military contingent in Angola numbered between 30,000 and 50,000 people in various years. It was the largest overseas military operation of any developing country in the 20th century. Cubans also fought in Ethiopia, helping the Mengistu regime repel a Somali invasion in 1977-78. They provided military aid to Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Congo. Simultaneously, Cuba sent thousands of doctors, teachers, and engineers to dozens of third world countries, from Africa to Southeast Asia. This medical diplomacy became one of the most effective tools of Cuban influence, and continues to this day. A key episode occurred in 1988, the Battle of Quito Cuaravali in Angola. Cuban and Angolan troops repelled an offensive by the South African Army, inflicting one of its most serious defeats in the history of the border war. This event, according to many historians, was the catalyst for the negotiations that led to Namibia's independence and, ultimately, to the collapse of the apartheid system in South Africa. Nelson Mandela, upon his release from prison, publicly thanked Cuba. The Cuban people occupy a special place in the hearts of the peoples of Africa. It was an amazing duality. A small island that suppressed freedom at home, fought for freedom on another continent. A state where people were deprived of the right to vote, helped other nations gain independence. A system incapable of providing basic abundance spent enormous resources on international adventures. How to reconcile these contradictions? Cuban history offers no simple answers. Inside Cuba, the 1970s became a period of institutionalization or, if you will, the bureaucratization of the revolution. The 1976 Constitution, approved by a referendum with a characteristic socialist result of 97% in favor, formally consolidated the structure of power. A one-party system led by the Communist Party of Cuba, the National Assembly of People's Power, and the Council of State. Castro became the president of the Council of State and the Council of Ministers, formally the leader of both the state and the government. But his power was never just formal. Castro governed Cuba through a combination of personal charisma, control over the army and special services, and skillful manipulation of various factions within the elite. The everyday life of ordinary Cubans in these decades was defined by the libreta, the ration book system for food distribution introduced in 1962, and in effect ever since. Every citizen received a set norm of rice, beans, sugar, oil, eggs, and other basic products at symbolic prices. The system provided a minimum. No one went hungry, but the variety was meager, and many goods were chronically in short supply. Queues became part of Cuban life, and patience became a necessary skill. Housing was provided by the state, but construction did not keep pace with demand. Many families lived in overcrowded apartments, in dilapidated colonial-era buildings that were crumbling without repair. Transport was a problem. The old American cars of the 50s, which later became Cuba's trademark, were driven not out of nostalgia, but because there were no new ones. They were repaired with striking ingenuity, replacing engines with Soviet parts and using homemade spare parts. Cubans learned to live in a system of scarcity, developing an entire culture of solving problems, finding a way out, and making do. A black market always existed, despite official bans. Acquaintances, connections, the exchange of services, and informal economy, without which the formal system could not function. In the cultural sphere, Cuban policy was inconsistent and often harsh. In the early years of the revolution, a certain pluralism existed. New cinema, new literature, and new theater flourished. Cuban cinematography, created practically from scratch through the Cuban Institute of Cinematographic Art and Industry, became one of the most vibrant in Latin America. The films of Tomás Gutiérrez Alea, Humberto Soles, and Santiago Alvarez received international acclaim. But in 1971, the Padilla affair, the arrest and forced public penance of the poet Humberto Padilla, whose poetry was deemed counter-revolutionary, shocked the world's intelligentsia. Jean-Paul Sartre, Julio Cortázar, Mario Vargas Llosa, Simone de Beauvoir, and dozens of other famous writers and thinkers signed an open letter of protest. Castro responded with his famous words to intellectuals: "Within the revolution, everything; against the revolution, nothing." This formula defined the boundaries of the permissible. One could create, but only within the framework established by the party. Many of the best Cuban writers, artists, and musicians left. Reynaldo Arenas, Guillermo Cabrera Infante, Jess Daz, Zoe Valls. The list is long. Their works were banned in Cuba. Their names were erased from cultural life. Cuba was losing its talent, and it was an irreparable loss. In 1980, an event occurred that exposed the depth of the crisis. In April, a group of Cubans burst onto the grounds of the Peruvian embassy in Havana, seeking political asylum. In a characteristically impulsive gesture, Castro announced that anyone who wished to could leave Cuba through the port of Mérida. The result exceeded all expectations. In a few months, about 125,000 people left the island as so-called Mérida boatlift. Castro tried to turn the crisis into a propaganda advantage. Prisoners from jails and psychiatric hospitals were intentionally sent among the migrants, allowing the regime to present all those who left as the scum of society. But the majority of the Marielitos were ordinary Cubans, tired of poverty, restrictions, and the lack of prospects. Their exodus was a silent referendum, the results of which were painful for the revolution. The 80s in Cuba were a time of relative stability, a sluggish, monotonous stability of a society in which nothing, in essence, changed. Soviet aid continued to flow. The army was strong, and the security apparatus was effective. Castro still delivered multi-hour speeches, still made decisions single-handedly, and still believed or said he believed in the inevitability of a communist future. But the world around him was changing. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the CPSU. Perestroika and glasnost began. Castro treated the Soviet reforms with undisguised suspicion. He saw in them a capitulation to the West, a betrayal of socialist ideals. While market reforms and political liberalization were discussed in Moscow, slogans about the rectification of errors and negative tendencies, a euphemism for a return to a more orthodox line, rang out in Havana. Castro was right about one thing. Gorbachev's reforms did lead to the collapse of the system. In 1989, the communist regimes in Eastern Europe fell, one after another, like dominoes. In 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. For Cuba, this was a catastrophe. Soviet subsidies stopped almost instantly. Trade with former socialist countries collapsed. Cuba lost about 80% of its foreign trade and about 70% of its imports. Gross domestic product fell by 30 to 35% in 3 years. It was an economic collapse comparable to the Great Depression, but in conditions where the country was already poor. The special period in peacetime began. This was what Castro called the era of survival, that lasted through the entire decade of the 90s, and has formally not ended to this day. Cubans remember the special period as a time of hunger, darkness, and hopelessness. Electricity was cut for 12 to 16 hours a day. Public transport practically disappeared. Food rations were cut to the minimum. The average Cuban lost between 5 and 20 pounds of weight. People ate whatever they could find. Banana peels, grapefruits instead of meat, fried rags soaked in sauce. Diseases related to vitamin deficiency appeared. Optical neuropathy affected thousands of people. The streets of Havana emptied. Cars stood without gasoline. People moved on bicycles. Cuba imported more than 1 million bicycles from China or on foot. Factories closed. The sugar industry, deprived of the Soviet market and Soviet technology, degraded. Production fell to 19th century levels. Under these conditions, the regime made forced concessions. Dollars were legalized until 1993. Possession of foreign currency was punishable by a prison sentence. Small private entrepreneurship, farmers' markets, and self-employment were permitted. The doors were opened for foreign investment, primarily in tourism. Tourism became the new sugar, a lifeline for the economy. Canadians, Europeans, and Latin Americans flocked to Cuba. The beaches of Varadero, the colonial center of Havana. Music, cigars, rum, authenticity. Varadero began to be covered with hotels from international chains. Havana received a cosmetic repair for tourist routes. A network of dollar stores, tiendas, was created, where goods unavailable in state stores could be bought for dollars. But tourism created a new problem, a dual economy. Cubans who had access to dollars through relatives abroad, through work in the tourism sector, or through the black market, lived immeasurably better than those who received their salary in pesos. A doctor earning $20 a month might envy a hotel maid receiving tips in foreign currency. Prostitution was reborn. Young Cuban women and men sold themselves to foreign tourists, and the authorities turned a blind eye because it brought in foreign currency. The equality upon which the ideology of the revolution was built crumbled. The racial dimension was particularly painful. Black Cubans, who had fewer relatives in the diaspora as early waves of migration were predominantly white, received fewer remittances and were less represented in the tourism sector. The inequality that the revolution had fought against was returning in new forms. How did Cuba survive? Many asked this question in the 90s, and the answer includes several factors. First, the security apparatus remained effective. Attempts at organized opposition were suppressed. Second, Cuba did not have a peaceful transition because there was no real alternative. The opposition was too weak, and civil society was too suppressed. Third, Castro himself remained popular among a significant part of the population, especially among the older generation who remembered Batista. Among the rural population who had received education and medicine from the revolution, and among black Cubans whose social status the revolution had raised. Fourth, the special period, for all its horrors, was not so deadly as to provoke a revolt. People were hungry, but they were not dying in mass numbers. They suffered, but they adapted. And one more factor. The United States, The American embargo, strengthened in 1992 by the Torricelli Act and in 1996 by the Helms-Burton Act, allowed Castro to blame all troubles on an external enemy. The blockade, as it was called in Cuba, was a real economic burden. Although many economists pointed out that the problems of the Cuban economy were explained primarily by internal causes, the inefficiency of planning, a lack of incentives, and excessive bureaucratization. Nevertheless, the embargo gave Castro a ready explanation for any economic failures. At the end of the 90s, a new ally appeared, Hugo Chávez, who came to power in Venezuela in 1999, became for Cuba what the Soviet Union had been a generous patron. Venezuela began to supply Cuba with oil at subsidized prices in exchange for Cuban doctors and specialists. This deal oil for doctors became the backbone of the Cuban economy for the next decade. The 2000s brought some relief. The economy stabilized, albeit at a low level. Tourism grew. Venezuelan oil provided energy supplies. Cuba expanded its medical diplomacy programs. Cuban doctors worked in dozens of countries, and this was a source not only of influence but also of income. The biotechnology industry, one of the few innovative achievements of Cuban science, developed a range of vaccines and drugs exported to developing countries, but the political system remained unchanged. Castro ruled unrivaled until July 31, 2006, when he underwent surgery for gastrointestinal bleeding and transferred power to his brother Raúl. This was the first change of leader in 47 years, and it occurred not through elections, not through a coup, but through biological necessity. Fidel never returned to active governance again. Raúl Castro, Fidel's younger brother, was a man of a different mold. Less charismatic, less public, more pragmatic. He had always been the organizer, the administrator, the man of the system. Unlike Fidel, who was a force of nature, Raúl managed the army, which by that point controlled a significant part of the Cuban economy through the military-run enterprise system, GISA. Having formally become president in 2008, after Fidel officially resigned from all posts, Raúl began cautious economic reforms. Opportunities for private entrepreneurship were expanded. Cubans were allowed to engage in more than 200 types of self-employed activities, from restaurants to barbershops. The buying and selling of real estate and cars were permitted before this. Citizens could not freely sell their own homes. Restrictions on traveling abroad were eased. These reforms were slow, inconsistent, and full of bureaucratic obstacles. Every step forward was accompanied by a step back, but they signified an acknowledgement of the obvious. The old model does not work. On November 25, 2016, Fidel Castro died. He was 90 years old. He had survived dozens of assassination attempts attributed to the CIA. The figure may be exaggerated, but the fact of the attempts is indisputable. He outlasted 10 American presidents, from Eisenhower to Obama. He outlasted the Soviet Union, which he had considered eternal. He survived the special period, when his regime seemed doomed. The world's reaction to his death demonstrated the same duality as his entire life. To some, he was a liberator, a fighter against imperialism, the man who gave the poor education and medicine to others, a tyrant who suppressed freedom, ruined the economy, and destroyed the lives of millions. The truth, as is often the case, was not in the middle, but in both statements simultaneously. Meanwhile, even during Fidel's lifetime, one of the most surprising diplomatic events of the 21st century occurred. On December 17, 2014, Presidents Barack Obama and Raúl Castro simultaneously announced the restoration of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba, which had been severed for over half a century. The negotiations were conducted in secret with the mediation of Canada and the Vatican. Pope Francis personally facilitated the rapprochement. In March 2016, Obama visited Havana, the first visit by a sitting American president to Cuba since 1928. When Calvin Coolidge had visited, Obama walked the streets of Old Havana, attended a baseball game, and delivered a speech broadcast on Cuban television. It seemed that the era of confrontation was ending, but the hopes proved premature. The administration of Donald Trump, which succeeded Obama, reversed the policy. Sanctions were tightened, diplomatic personnel were reduced, and restrictions on travel and remittances were restored. Mysterious acoustic attacks on American diplomats in Havana, the so-called Havana syndrome, the nature of which has still not been established with certainty, served as a pretext for further cooling. Cuban-American relations returned roughly to the states they had been in 4 decades. A frozen conflict, mutual distrust, the embargo, rhetoric, and fatigue. Meanwhile, a quiet, but inexorable transformation was taking place in Cuba. In 2018, Raúl Castro handed over the presidency to Miguel Diaz-Canel. For the first time in 6 decades, the head of the Cuban state was someone not from the Castro family. Diaz-Canel, born in 1960 after the revolution, was an Apache who had grown up within the system. His rise to power did not signify a change in course. Raúl Castro retained the post of first secretary of the party until 2021, and the military continued to control key sectors of the economy. But biological time was working against the system. The generation of the revolution's founders was passing away. Young Cubans, who grew up during and after the special period, had no emotional connection to the revolutionary mythology. They saw the world through the internet, slow and expensive, yet accessible since the mid-2000s. They knew how people lived in other countries, and they wanted more than the ration system and multi-hour speeches. In 2019, a new constitution was adopted via referendum naturally. It included some changes: the recognition of private property, albeit with caveats, the mention of market mechanisms, and the introduction of the post of Prime Minister. But the one-party system, the leading role of the Communist Party, and the absence of political pluralism remained unchanged. The 2020 pandemic hit Cuba particularly hard. Not so much epidemiologically. The Cuban healthcare system managed relatively well, and its own vaccines, Abdullah and Sobhana, were developed and administered. But economically, tourism, which by then had become the largest source of foreign currency, collapsed. Venezuela, experiencing its own economic crisis, reduced oil supplies. A monetary reform, the so-called ordering to ordenamiento, the unification of 2 currencies into one, carried out in January 2021, led to a sharp rise in inflation and a drop in living standards. And on July 11, 2021, something happened that Cuba had not seen in decades. Mass spontaneous protests. Thousands of people took to the streets in dozens of cities across the island. They shouted, "Freedom!" and "We are hungry." They demanded change. These were not dissidents or an organized opposition. They were ordinary Cubans driven to despair by shortages, power outages, rising prices, and, for the first time on a mass scale, the COVID crisis. The authorities suppressed the protests. Mass arrests were carried out. Hundreds of people received prison sentences, some up to 25 years. The internet was shut down. Diaz-Canel appeared on television with a call for revolutionaries to take to the streets and protect the revolution. It was the language of the past addressed to a reality that no longer accepted it. After the 2021 protests, emigration from Cuba intensified sharply. In 2022 to 2023, hundreds of thousands of Cubans left the island more than ever before. Many left through Nicaragua and Mexico, attempting to reach the United States border. It was an exodus comparable to Mariel in scale, but exceeding it in desperation. The young, educated, and able-bodied were leaving those who were supposed to build Cuba's future. The island was losing its lifeblood, and not just figuratively. The energy crisis reached new depths. Old power plants, built with Soviet assistance and not updated for decades, broke down one after another. Power outages became a daily norm, lasting 8, 12, sometimes 16 hours a day. Without electricity, refrigerators, air conditioners, and water pumps did not work. Life in a hot tropical climate without these basic amenities was excruciating. The food crisis deepened. The shelves of state stores were empty. Prices in private markets rose faster than wages. The typical Cuban diet in these years was meager to the limit. Meat became a rarity, milk a deficit. Even rice and beans, the staple of Cuban cuisine, were not always available. The medical system, once the pride of the revolution, degraded. Hospitals experienced shortages of medicine, equipment, and supplies. Doctors were leaving either into emigration or to work in other countries through state programs, where the Cuban government took most of their income. Infrastructure was decaying. Buildings were literally collapsing. In Havana, the collapse of residential buildings became a regular occurrence. And through all this, the island continued to exist. Cubans, accustomed to crises over decades, survived with a persistence that can be called heroic or forced. Families depended on remittances from relatives abroad. The small business private sector, legalized by cautious reforms, fed those who could afford it. The informal economy, which had always existed alongside the official one, became the primary form of survival for most. As for the political system, it remained frozen. Diaz-Canel continued the rhetoric of revolutionary continuity and socialism. The party continued to control everything. Independent journalists, bloggers, and activists were subjected to persecution, arrest, searches, and travel bans. The San Isidro movement, a group of independent artists and activists who spoke out for creative freedom, was crushed by the police. Cuba at the beginning of the 21st century resembled an island stuck between two eras. Formerly a socialist state with a planned economy and a one-party system, effectively a country where the state sector, private business, foreign investment, the black market, and remittances from emigration coexisted. The ideology was hollowed out but not abolished. The symbols remained in place, but without content. Portraits of Che and Fidel were on the walls, but the eyes of the young lacked the former spark. Could things have been done differently? This question haunts anyone who studies Cuban history. Was there an alternative to the radicalization of the revolution? What if the United States had not responded with hostility to Castro's reforms? Could Cuba have become something like a social democratic Costa Rica? What if Castro, like Deng Xiaoping in China, had carried out economic reforms while maintaining political control? What if the embargo had been lifted earlier, or later, or not at all? These questions have no answers. History is not a laboratory. Experiments cannot be repeated. But the very fact that they are asked testifies to the scale of the Cuban tragedy, or, if you will, the Cuban drama. An island too small for ideas too big, an economy too fragile for projects too ambitious, too little room for maneuver between two superpowers. Let us stop for a moment and think about what Cuba means for the world. Not as a state, not as a political project, but as a symbol, as an idea, as a myth. For the Latin American left, Cuba was a beacon, proof that revolution is possible, that one can challenge the United States and survive. This myth was powerful, and it inspired a generation of fighters, from the Nicaraguan Sandinistas to Bolivian miners. It also led to numerous tragedies. Guerrilla movements inspired by the Cuban example suffered defeat after defeat, and each defeat cost lives. For American conservatives, Cuba was the embodiment of the communist threat at the doorstep 90 miles from Florida, a red dot on the map, an insult to the Monroe Doctrine. This fear defined American policy in the region for decades and often took irrational forms. For European intellectuals, especially in the 60s and 70s, Cuba was a romantic project, a place where history was made by the hands of young, bearded men with rifles, where poetry and revolution went hand in hand. This romanticism was often blind to the real suffering of Cubans and to the brutality of the regime. For Africans, especially South Africans, Cuba was an ally in the struggle against apartheid and colonialism. Cuban bloodshed in Angola and Ethiopia created a bond that political changes have not erased. For the Cubans themselves, those who stayed and those who left, Cuba was and remains a home that is impossible to forget or to accept. as it is. Nostalgia, anger, love, bitterness, pride, all these feelings are intertwined in a knot that is impossible to untangle. And there is one more aspect of Cuban history that deserves to be discussed separately: culture. Because for all the political and economic failures, Cuban culture of the 20th and 21st centuries is a phenomenon of global scale. Cuban music is perhaps the island's most significant contribution to world culture. Son cubano, mambo, cha-cha-cha, rumba, timba, reggaeton, these genres, born in Cuba or from Cuban roots, have conquered the entire world. In the 1920s through the 50s, Cuba was one of the world centers of popular music. Benny Moore, the barbarian of rhythm, is considered one of the greatest singers in the history of Latin American music. Arsenio Rodriguez, a blind musician from Matanzas, revolutionized the son and laid the foundations for salsa. Pres Prado brought the mambo to Hollywood. Chano Pozo, the legendary percussionist, collaborated with Dizzy Gillespie and brought Afro-Cuban rhythms into jazz. After the revolution, music did not disappear, it transformed. Nueva Trova, the singer-songwriter movement associated with the names of Silvio Rodriguez and Pablo Milans, created an entire layer of poetic, politically engaged music that became the soundtrack of the revolution for a generation of Latin Americans. Simultaneously, jazz, son, and classical music continued to develop. Cuban conservatories trained world-class musicians. In 1997, when Wenda's film Buena Vista Social Club and the eponymous album recorded by Raikuda introduced the world to a group of elderly Cuban musicians who had been almost forgotten. Ibrahim Ferrer, Campe Segundo, Rub Gonzalez, Amara Portuondo, their music, with roots reaching back to pre-revolutionary Cuba, became a global sensation. The album sold millions of copies, and the film showed a lower Havana, dilapidated, beautiful, sad, and alive. Cuban literature was also significant. José Lima, author of the Baroque novel Paradiso, created one of the most complex works of Latin American prose. Alejo Carpentier, a Cuban with French roots, became one of the founders of magical realism long before Garcia Marquez. Nicholas Guillén, Cuba's national poet, combined African rhythms with the Spanish poetic tradition. Many of the greatest Cuban writers, as already mentioned, ended up in immigration, but even in exile they continued to create literature inseparable from the Cuban experience. Cuban cinema, despite meager resources, created a series of masterpieces. Memories of Underdevelopment by Tomás Gutiérrez, a ear-piercing satire on the Cuban intelligentsia. Luca by Humberto Sols, a three-part epic about Cuban women in different historical eras. Strawberry and Chocolate, a film about the friendship between a gay artist and a young communist, which became one of the most successful Cuban films abroad. Cuban fine arts, dance, and ballet all reached levels incomparable to the size and wealth of the country. The National Ballet of Cuba, founded by Alicia Alonso, was one of the best ballet companies in the world. Cuban artists Wilfredo Lam, Ren Portocarrero, and Emilia Paz occupied a worthy place in world art. Culture was simultaneously a weapon of the regime and a space of resistance. The state funded art but controlled it. Artists enjoyed state support, but were expected not to cross an invisible red line. Where this line was drawn was never quite clear, and this created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. Some found ways to tell the truth through allegories and subtext. Some compromised, some left, and some fell silent. Sports is another sphere where Cuba achieved results incomparable to its size. Boxing, baseball, track and field, judo, wrestling, volleyball, in all these disciplines, Cuban athletes won Olympic medals and world titles. Teofilo Stevenson, a threefold Olympic boxing champion, could have turned professional and earned millions, but he stayed in Cuba. What is $1 million compared to the love of 8 million Cubans? He said. This phrase became a classic of revolutionary mythology, though one cannot know if the choice was truly voluntary. In the 21st century, Cuban sports experienced a decline. The best athletes fled. Baseball players to the American leagues, boxers abroad, track athletes to wherever they could earn a living. The training system, built on the Soviet model, degraded along with the economy. Let us return to our main narrative. Cuba after Fidel is a country in search of identity. The old ideology does not work, but there is no new one. Economic reforms are carried out too slowly and too timidly. The youth are leaving, the population is aging, infrastructure is crumbling, and yet Cuba remains Cuban island that cannot be reduced to a single formula. Whether it be a communist hell or a revolutionary paradise, it is more complex than any definition. Let us take an imaginary walk through Havana. The Malecon, an embankment stretching 8 kilometers along the sea. In the evening, teenagers sit on the parapet with phones, catching Wi-Fi from the nearest hotspot. Fishermen cast their lines. Couples embrace. The salty wind from the sea mixes with the smell of exhaust from passing main drones. The old American cars that have become the symbol of the city. Waves crash against the rocks, dousing passers-by with spray. Old Havana, Habana Vieja, a labyrinth of narrow streets, dilapidated palaces, and restored squares. Cathedral Square, the Plaza de Armas, Street, Francis Square, each has its own mood, its own light. The restoration, begun during Fidel's lifetime under the leadership of city historian Eusebio Leal, turned part of the old city into a tourist showroom. But you only need to turn into a side street to see another Havana. Crumbling walls, laundry on ropes between balconies, children playing in alleyways, the sound of dominoes on a wooden table. Central Havana, Centro Habana, the district where most Havanans live. Here, the population density is one of the highest in the Caribbean. Buildings constructed in the early 20th century have not been repaired for decades. Inner courtyards have been turned into communal apartments called solares, where several families share one kitchen and one toilet. Here is Cuba without embellishment. Noisy, cramped, alive, poor. Vedado, once an elegant suburb, where the middle class lived in the 50s, and now the district of embassies, the university, and old mansions divided into communal flats. Here stands the former Havana Hilton Hotel, renamed Habana Libre, where Castro set up his headquarters in the early days of the revolution. Beyond Havana lies another Cuba, Violes, a valley in the province of Pinar del Rio with tobacco fields and Mogote's rounded limestone hills, overgrown with tropical greenery. Trinidad, a colonial town frozen in time with cobbled streets and pastel facades. Camagüey with its labyrinth of crooked alleys, designed according to legend to confuse pirates. Santiago de Cuba, the cradle of the revolution, the country's second city, located in the east, hotter, more African, more musical than Havana. In the countryside, there are villages where people live as their grandfathers and great-grandfathers did. The boho, a wooden house with a palm roof, is still not a rarity. Oxen pull the plough. Sugar cane grows in the fields, although the industry that processes it has long been in decline. Of the 160 sugar mills active in the middle of the 20th century, fewer than 3 dozen remain. Cuba is also its emigration. More than 2 million Cubans live outside the island. Most are in the United States, primarily in Miami. Little Havana district of Miami that became the cultural and political center of the Cuban diaspora. It lives by its own laws. The older generation, those who fled the revolution in the 60s, dreamed of returning until the end of their lives and hated Castro with a fury that did not weaken over the years. Their children and grandchildren are already Americans, but with a Cuban accent. They preserve the language, the cuisine, the music, but their connection to the island weakens with each generation. The Cuban diaspora has exerted a huge influence on American politics. The Cuban lobby is one of the most powerful ethnic lobbies in Washington for decades. It ensured the maintenance of the embargo. Congressmen and senators of Cuban origin Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Bob Menendez became prominent figures in national politics. They were also among the most ardent opponents of any rapprochement with Havana. But changes have also occurred within the diaspora. Later waves of migration, the Marielitos of the 80s, the Bolseros, the rafters who fled on homemade rafts in the 90s, and the 21st century immigrants are less anti-communist and more pragmatic. They left not because of ideology, but because of poverty. They send money to relatives in Cuba, travel to visit family, and maintain ties. Their attitude toward the regime is more one of fatigue than hatred. What awaits Cuba? This question has been asked for several decades, and there is still no unambiguous answer. Optimists speak of a gradual transformation, a Cuban perestroika, a slow transition to a mixed economy, while preserving social achievements. Pessimists predict economic collapse, mass migration, and possibly chaos. Realists point out that the Cuban system possesses an amazing capacity for survival. It survived the collapse of the USSR, the special period, the change of leader, and the pandemic, and each time proved more resilient than its critics predicted. Let us return even further to the very beginning, to the island Columbus called the most beautiful land, to the Tono, who slept in hammocks and smoked tobacco, to the Africans who carried their rhythms across the ocean in the holds of slave ships, to the Spaniards who built fortresses and plantations, to the Criollos who dreamed of freedom, to the slaves who fled to the mountains, to Joe Smart writing poetry in a New York apartment, to the bearded young men in the Sierra Maestra mountains, to the children who learned to read by lantern light, to the old men playing dominoes in the courtyards of central Havana, to the young women dancing in clubs that no one will write about in textbooks. This whole history is not a line, but a spiral. The same motifs return: dependence on external forces, the struggle for sovereignty, the promise of utopia, the collision of utopia with reality, sacrifices made in the name of a future that never arrived. Spain promised civilization and brought slavery. The United States promised freedom and brought dependence. The revolution promised equality and brought a lack of freedom. Each new era was a response to the failure of the previous one, and created the conditions for the next failure. But in this spiral, there is something else, a stubborn, indestructible human life that continues in spite of everything. Music that does not fall silent. Humor that does not run dry. Cuban choteo humor. Ironic, self-deprecating, and redemptive. The ability to find joy in small things: a glass of rum, a good song, the evening breeze on the Malecon. Family ties that are stronger than any ideology. The ability to find beauty in ruins, and Havana, for all its dilapidation, remains one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Cuba does not fit into any simple narrative scheme. It is not proof of the collapse of socialism, because Cuban socialism created real achievements in education, healthcare, culture, and racial equality. It is not proof of the success of socialism, because the Cuban economy is chronically inefficient, political freedoms are suppressed, and the youth are leaving en masse. It is not a simple victim of American imperialism, although the embargo and decades of hostility have caused real damage. It is not a simple victim of its own government, although the mistakes, authoritarianism, and ideological inflexibility of Castro and his successors are obvious. Cuba is all of this simultaneously, and it is precisely this complexity, this irreducibility to formulas, that makes its history so fascinating and so sad. There is one image that, perhaps, conveys the essence better than any analysis. The Havana Malek at night. The moon reflects in the black water. Somewhere in an old house, a piano sounds. A jazz standard, played slightly differently with a Cuban swing. An old man sits on the parapet, who remembers everything. The revolution, the missile crisis, the special period, and a young man who remembers none of this and thinks only about how to leave. Between them lie 60 years of history. They sit side by side, and the waves break against the rocks as they broke 500 years ago, when people lived secretly on these shores and did not suspect the existence of Europe. Now let us talk in more detail about some aspects of Cuban history that deserve closer attention. Let us return to the colonial era and consider what often remains. Outside the framework of popular narratives, the 17th and 18th centuries in Cuba were an era when the island lived in the shadow of the richer and more important Spanish colonies, Mexico and Peru. That is where ambitions, capital, and human resources were directed. Cuba remained the key to the Indies, a strategic crossroads through which the silver convoys passed, but not an independent center of wealth. This created a curious situation. While the Spanish administration was focused on guarding the port of Havana and ensuring the smooth operation of the Correo de Indias, the interior regions of the island lived a fairly autonomous life. Small farmers, cattle ranchers, smugglers, all of this existed off the radar of the colonial bureaucracy. Contraband, in fact, was not so much a deviation as it was the norm. Official trade was limited by the Spanish monopoly, and the southern ports of Cuba, Trinidad, Cienfuegos, Santiago actively traded with British, French, and Dutch merchants in circumvention of the law. Pirates and privateers were a constant threat, but also a source of certain economic activity. Ports where pirates could sell their loot and buy supplies flourished. The border between legitimate trade, smuggling, and piracy was blurred. Many Cuban families owe their initial capital precisely to this grey space between the legal and illegal. The religious life of colonial Cuba also deserves attention. The Catholic Church was part of the colonial machine. Monasteries, parishes, and missions were established in parallel with fortresses and plantations. But the influence of the Church in Cuba was less than in Mexico or Peru, where powerful theocratic structures existed. Cuban Catholicism was rather superficial. Formal rites, holidays, baptisms, weddings, funerals, but without that deep penetration into everyday life that characterized a more religious society. This, perhaps, explains the ease with which syncretic religion Santeria, Palo Mayombe, Aboku spread among the population. African cults did not so much replace Catholicism as they filled the void it left behind. And what is important, they gave the black and mulatto population a space of autonomy, of spiritual self-governance, which did not exist in official religious and political life. The system of cabildos de nation, associations of Africans by ethnic origin, was one form of such autonomy. Formally, these were religious brotherhoods permitted by the Spanish authorities as a means of control and the Christianization of slaves. In fact, they became repositories of African culture, languages, music, dance, and religious practices. It was through the cabildos that the rhythms of the bat drums, the rituals of the Yoruba religion, songs, and legends were passed down from generation to generation. Secret societies, especially Aboku, which arose from the traditions of the Calabar ethnic group, played an important role in the life of port cities. Aboku were male brotherhoods, similar to Masonic lodges, with initiation rituals, a hierarchy, and a system of mutual aid. Membership gave protection, connections, and a sense of belonging, things that uprooted generations of slaves desperately needed. Aboku exists even today, and its influence on Cuban culture, especially music, is immeasurable. Let us move now to the 19th century and look more closely at the processes that led to the wars for independence. Cuban society in the mid-19th century was torn by many contradictions. Racial, between whites, mulattoes, and blacks; class, between the latter fundis de planters, small farmers, the urban middle class, artisans, and landless peasants; regional, between the rich West Havana, Matanzas, and the poor East Oriente, Camagüey; and political, between supporters of independence, annexationists, autonomists desiring broad autonomy within Spain, and reformists. Spanish policy exacerbated these rifts. Madrid used divide and rule tactics, pitting groups against one another, fueling racial fears, promising reforms, and failing to fulfill those promises. The Peninsular Spaniards born in Spain and temporarily residing in Cuba held a privileged position in trade and administration, which caused resentment among the Criollo population. Intellectual life was surprisingly rich. The Cuban aristocracy sent their sons to study in Europe. Literary salons, scientific societies, and newspapers all existed, albeit under the watchful eye of the censor, Félix Varela, a priest-thinker who is called the one who first taught us how to think, advocated for independence and the abolition of slavery as early as the 1820s. He spent the last decades of his life in exile in New York, publishing a newspaper and helping Irish immigrants, an unusual intersection of two colonial fates. José Antonio Seco, a historian and publicist, was one of the main ideologues of Cuban Criollo nationalism. He spoke out against slavery and the slave trade, but at the same time feared the Africanization of Cuba, and supported the policy of whitening the population through immigration from Europe. This position of racially colored nationalism that desired a free, but white Cuba was widespread among the Criollo elite and complicated any attempts to create a unified liberation front. Efforts to attract white emigrants to Cuba had limited success. In the 1840s and 50s, an exotic attempt was made to solve the labor problem by importing contract workers from China. From 1847 to 1874, more than 120,000 Chinese coolies were brought to Cuba. The terms of their contracts differed little from slavery: an 8-year term, hard labor on plantations, and corporal punishment. Many died, some committed suicide. Those who survived and finished their contracts settled on the island, creating a Chinese community that became part of the Cuban mosaic. Chinatown in Havana Barrio Chino was once one of the largest in Latin America. The 10 Years' War, which we have already discussed, was not just a military conflict, it was a social revolution, at least in the east of the island. Former slaves, fighting side by side with former masters, gained a new identity. Military ranks gave black fighters authority that was impossible in civilian life. War created links between people of different races and classes, fragile, ambiguous, but real. Antonio Maceo, whom we have already mentioned, was not just an outstanding military man. He was a symbol of the fact that racial barriers could be overcome. His mother, Mariana Grioles, became a legend in her own right, the mother of the homeland, a woman who gave all her sons to the revolution. Maceo was wounded in battle more than 20 times and continued to fight. His death in December 1896, in an ambush near Havana during the last war for independence, was a heavy blow for the rebels. The War of 189,598 was even more brutal than the 10 Years' War. Spain sent more than 200,000 soldiers to Cuba's massive army for a colonial conflict. Most of them were young conscripts from poor regions of Spain, who had no desire to fight in the tropics. Diseases, primarily yellow fever and malaria, killed more Spanish soldiers than Cuban bullets. By some estimates, out of a total number of Spanish losses, around 60,000, only a small part were killed in battle, the rest died from disease. General Weyler's reconcentricin policy deserves more detailed consideration. Its essence was simple: to deprive the rebels of support from the peasant population by relocating it into controlled zones. In practice, this meant mass deportation. Hundreds of thousands of rural residents were herded into cities and fortified settlements, where there was no housing, no food, and no sanitary conditions. People died from hunger and epidemics. Children made up a disproportionately high share of the victims. Weyler was recalled in 1897, partly under pressure from international criticism, but the damage was done. This experienced mass displacement of the civilian population as a military strategy would be repeated in the 20th century again and again in different countries and contexts. Cuba was one of the first places where it was applied on such a scale. The Spanish-American War of 1898 also had aspects that are usually overlooked. The role of black Cuban and American soldiers, for example. The Cuban insurgent army at the time of American intervention was predominantly black and mulatto. White officers commanded, but the bulk of the fighters were descendants of slaves. American commanders, many of whom were racists and veterans of the Indian Wars in the West, treated their Cuban allies with contempt. General Shafter, who commanded the American Expeditionary Forces, described the Cuban rebels as a mob of degenerates unworthy of assistance. On the part of the United States, Black Buffalo soldiers of black regiments also participated in the campaign, and showed exceptional bravery in the battles at San Juan Hill, but their merits were eclipsed by the story of Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Racism defined not only the attitude toward Cubans, but also the internal dynamics of the American army. After the war, the racial question became one of the central issues in the new Cuban Republic. The 1901 Constitution formally guaranteed the equality of all citizens, but the practice of racial discrimination continued. Blacks and mulattoes were represented in the army and police, but were almost entirely absent from business, law, and the higher echelons of politics. Social clubs, schools, and parks were segregated not by law, as in the southern United States, but by custom. The Independent Party of Color, founded in 1908 by Evaristo Espinosa and Pedro Ivanet, became the first attempt to create a black political party in Cuba. It demanded equal access to government positions, an end to racial discrimination, and education reform. In 1910, the Mora Law was passed named after its author, Senator Martin Mora Delgado, himself a mulatto, which prohibited the creation of political parties based on race. The Independent Party of Color found itself outlawed. In May 1912, members of the party raised an armed protest in Oriente province. The government's response was disproportionately brutal. The army conducted a punitive operation during which thousands of black people were killed. Not only participants in the protest but also civilians. It was a true massacre, the scale of which remains a subject of debate to this day. It suppressed the independent political movement of black Cubans for a long time, and drove the racial question underground. The 1959 revolution proclaimed racial equality, and indeed took serious steps. The desegregation of beaches, parks, and clubs, opening access to education and healthcare, and the promotion of black people to government positions. But at the same time, Castro announced that the racial problem had been solved, and banned any discussion of racial inequality as counter-revolutionary, thereby making it impossible to solve those aspects of the problem that continued to exist. Black Cubans were still less represented in leadership positions, still more likely to live in worse conditions, and still faced everyday racism. But it was forbidden to talk about it. This situation, official equality, alongside actual inequality, exacerbated by the impossibility of discussion, persists into the 21st century. Black Cuban intellectuals and activists are trying to raise this topic, but encounter resistance both from the state and from a society accustomed to believing that there is no racism in Cuba. Another aspect deserving of attention is the role of women in Cuban history. From Mariana Grajales to Celia Sanchez, from the nameless tobacco workers of Tampa to the female brigadistas of the Literacy campaign, women were an integral part of all key processes, although their role often remained invisible. Celia Sanchez was perhaps the most influential woman in the history of the Cuban Revolution. She was an organizer of the urban underground in Oriente, helped prepare the Granma landing, climbed into the mountains, and became a close associate and, by many accounts, the lover of Fidel Castro. After the victory of the revolution, she held various posts, but her real influence was informal. She was Fidel's gatekeeper, through whom all business passed. Her death from cancer in 1980, according to eyewitness accounts, was one of the few moments when Castro publicly displayed deep grief. Vilma Espien, the wife of Raúl Castro, headed the Federation of Cuban Women, the most mass-based women's organization in the country. Under her leadership, laws were passed regarding equal pay, maternity leave, and women's access to education and professions. Cuba achieved one of the highest rates of female participation in politics in Latin America, but the federation was a state structure, and an independent women's movement was not allowed. The question of women's rights intersected with other complex topics, primarily the rights of the LGBT community. The persecution of homosexuals in the 60s and 70s was systematic and cruel. UMUP camps, forced treatment, dismissal from work, and social contempt. All of this was part of a revolutionary policy based on machista notions of what a real revolutionary should be. Reinaldo Arenas, one of the greatest Cuban writers of the 20th century, described this experience in detail in his autobiographical novel Before Night Falls, a book that remains one of the most stunning testimonies of life in Cuba. In later decades, the situation gradually changed. Mariela Castro ESPN, the daughter of Raúl Castro and Vilma ESPN, became the main advocate for sexual minority rights in Cuba. It is a paradoxical situation where the ruler's daughter fights for the rights of those who were persecuted by the order of his predecessor. In 2022, same-sex marriage was legalized in Cuba through a referendum, the results of which, despite all caveats about freedom of expression in a one-party state, were real. Now let us turn to another theme, the economic history of Cuba, in more detail. Because behind the political events and revolutionary mythology lies an economic history, without which everything else hangs in the air. For 5 centuries, the Cuban economy has been defined by one word: monoculture. First gold, then cattle, then tobacco, then sugar again, and once more, sugar. Dependency on a single export commodity. The curse of sugar was a structural problem that neither the colonial administration, nor the Republic, nor the Revolution could solve. The sugar economy created a specific social structure. Latifundistas, the owners of large plantations, were at the top. Colonos, small farmers who grew cane and sold it to the mills, occupied an intermediate position. Seasonal workers, dependent on the zafra, were at the bottom. The sugar season lasted 4 to 5 months. The rest of the year was dead time. Workers remained without earnings, in poverty, waiting for the next zafra. This rhythm defined the lives of millions of Cubans. The revolution attempted to destroy this structure, but ultimately reproduced the dependency in another form. Instead of selling sugar on the world market, Cuba sold it to the Soviet Union at fixed prices. When the USSR vanished, this support vanished too. ATTEMPTS at diversification equal. Citrus fruits, biotechnology, tourism yielded limited results. The question of land ownership was central to every era of Cuban history. The Spanish crown distributed land to conquistadors. American companies bought it up after 1898. The revolution confiscated and redistributed it, and then largely collectivized it. State farms, granges, proved inefficient. Cooperatives created in the 80s worked a little better. Small private farmers, campesinos, who were allowed to keep small plots, produced a disproportionately large share of the food. In the 21st century, Cuba imports most of its food from 60 to 80%, according to various estimates. For a tropical island with fertile soil and a favorable climate, this is a striking and sad fact. The reasons: the inefficiency of state agriculture, shortages of fertilizers, machinery and fuel, and bureaucratic obstacles for private farmers. The American embargo is a topic that cannot be avoided. Introduced in 1960 and consistently tightened, it became the longest-lasting economic embargo in modern history. Its supporters argue that it is a tool of pressure against an authoritarian regime, its opponents, and among them are practically all the countries of the world, who vote annually in the UN General Assembly for a resolution condemning the blockade, consider it cruel, ineffective, and counterproductive. The real impact of the embargo is difficult to assess in isolation from other factors. Cuba trades with Canada, Europe, Latin America, China, and Russia. The embargo is not an absolute blockade, but it limits access to American technology, capital, and markets, and, thanks to the extraterritorial sanctions of the Helms-Burton Act, deters third-party contractors. The Cuban government estimates the total damage from the embargo at hundreds of billions of dollars over all the years of its operation. This figure is likely inflated, but the magnitude is perceptible. What is indisputable is that the embargo became a convenient propaganda tool for the Cuban government. Any economic failure could be blamed on the blockade. Any shortage could be explained by imperialist aggression. This turned the embargo into a paradoxical gift to the regime. The stronger the pressure from outside, the easier it is to justify internal restrictions. Let us move now to another little-known, but important aspect of Cuban history: relations with the Soviet Union, which were much more complex and contradictory than usually depicted. The Soviet Union began actively supporting Cuba in 1960, but the relationship was never cloudless. Castro was not a submissive client of Moscow. He fiercely criticized Soviet behavior during the Missile Crisis. He pursued his own foreign policy in Africa and Latin America, often without coordinating it with the Kremlin. He supported guerrilla movements in countries where the Soviet Union preferred to maintain diplomatic relations with existing governments. In the late 60s, a serious conflict arose. Moscow demanded that Cuba take a more pragmatic approach to economics and foreign policy. Castro insisted on moral incentives and revolutionary activism. Khrushchev had already been removed from power. Brezhnev took a more conservative position. Economic pressure and the threat of reducing oil supplies forced Castro to yield. In 1968, he publicly supported the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, a decision that, by his own account, did not come easily to him. In the 1970s, Cuba was integrated into the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance (Comecon) and adopted the Soviet model of economic planning. This meant not only subsidies, but also bureaucratization, standardization, and a loss of initiative. Cuban enterprises began operating according to Soviet templates. Cuban managers went to Moscow for internships. Cuban students studied in Soviet universities. Thousands of Soviet specialists worked in Cuba, and their presence was noticeable. However, unlike the American presence before the revolution, it did not create enclaves of luxury. Soviet engineers and technicians lived modestly, though still better than most Cubans. Soviet influence also manifested in culture. Although Cubans resisted it with their characteristic humor, Soviet films were shown in cinemas. Soviet books were sold in stores. Lada and Moskvich cars drove along Cuban roads, but Cubans preferred their own music to Soviet music, their own rum to Soviet vodka, and adapted Soviet jokes in a Cuban way. One of the paradoxes of this union: Cuba was much poorer than the Soviet Union, but in some respects, for example, in music, dance, sensuality, and street culture, it was immeasurably richer. Soviet tourists coming to Cuba experienced cultural shock not from the poverty, but from the vitality and tropical intensity of life, which differed so much from the grayness of late Soviet daily existence. With the collapse of the USSR, Cuban feelings toward their former patron were mixed. Gratitude for decades of support sat alongside resentment for the sudden departure. The understanding that the Soviet Union had also used Cuba for its own purposes, as a strategic bridgehead, as a showcase for socialism in the Third World, grew as ideological illusions dissipated. Let us return to the special period and describe it through the everyday details that provide a fuller picture of what Cubans endured. Morning in Havana, mid-90s. There is no electricity. It has been cut since midnight and might return by noon. The windows are open. Without air conditioning or a fan, the heat is unbearable. There is almost nothing in the kitchen. Yesterday, someone managed to buy eggs for the family. There is rice, but it must be stretched. Coffee is diluted with peas because real coffee is unobtainable. There is no milk. It is only issued to children under 7 years old. Leaving the house, a person walks to work. There are no buses. The bicycle was stolen last week. A 3 km walk in tropical heat. But that is not even the worst of it. At work, office, hospital, school, factory, there is nothing to do because there are no materials, no electricity, and no point. The salary is a few hundred pesos, which are worth nothing. On the black market, a dollar costs 150 pesos. For lunch, it's rice and beans again. In the evening, the same. If lucky, an acquaintance gets a piece of pork. Pigs are secretly raised in apartments, on balconies, in bathrooms. It sounds fantastic, but it was a reality. Cubans raised pigs in city apartments because meat was otherwise unobtainable. At night, darkness. The city is plunged into gloom, only the moon and stars remain. Havanans, used to street lighting, found themselves in medieval darkness. Falls, injuries, and crimes happened in the dark. But there were also unexpected consequences. People went out into the streets, sat on porches, and talked, because there was nothing to do in a dark apartment. Some recall this time with bitter nostalgia, as a period when neighbors became closer, community ties strengthened, and life stripped of electricity and television became, in some sense, more human. It was precisely during the special period that the phenomenon of inventor flourished, ingenuity born of necessity. Cubans converted trucks into buses, old compressors into water pumps, tires into shoes, and aluminum cans into dishes. They brewed beer from bread, made steaks from grapefruit rinds, and manufactured soap from fat and lye. This forced creativity became part of the Cuban identity, a subject of both pride and bitterness. The balseros, those who fled the island on homemade rafts, were an extreme manifestation of despair. The Florida Straits, 90 miles of open sea with strong currents, sharks, and storms took the lives of thousands. The exact number is unknown. Bodies sank, rafts disintegrated, and people were carried out into the open ocean. Everyone who stepped onto a raft knew they might not make it. Many did not. In 1994, the crisis reached a boiling point. On August 5th, the Malecon occurred in Havana. Spontaneous riots on the embankment. The only time until 2021 when Cubans took to the streets in mass protest. Castro personally came to the Malecon and, according to eyewitnesses, diffused the situation with his presence. But he also made the decision to open the border. Anyone who wanted to leave could do so. Thousands of Cubans rushed to the sea. The Balseros crisis of 1994 led to negotiations with the United States, and a migration agreement by which the states committed to issuing at least 20,000 visas a year to Cuban migrants. The wet feet, dry feet policy was also established. Cubans intercepted at sea were returned to the island. Those who reached the American shore could stay. This policy, in effect until 2017, created perverse incentives and many human tragedies. The 2000s brought a new turn in Cuban-American relations. The George W. Bush administration tightened sanctions and restricted travel and remittances. The war on terror pushed Cuban issues into the background, but Guantanamo reminded the world of itself in a new capacity. After September 11, 2001, the military base became a detention center for terrorism suspects, a prison. That became a symbol of American abuses. Cuba protested the use of its territory for these purposes, but had no means to influence the situation. The Obama administration, as already mentioned, attempted to normalize relations. Secret negotiations through Canada and the Vatican led to the historic announcement on December 17, 2014. Embassies were opened and travel restrictions were eased. American tourists flooded into Havana. It seemed that half a century of confrontation was ending, but Cuba was in no hurry to change. Economic reforms remained timid. The political system was closed. Dissidents remained under pressure. Raúl Castro made it clear that normalizing relations with Washington did not mean internal liberalization. "We are not negotiating our internal system," he said. The Obama Thaw did not last long. Trump reversed the course. Biden, despite promises to return to Obama's policy, has done little. Cuban-American relations remain a hostage to domestic U.S. politics. The voices of the Cuban diaspora in Florida, key swing state, have a disproportionate influence on federal policy. A separate chapter of Cuban history is the relationship with Latin America. For decades, Cuba was a source of inspiration for some, and a source of anxiety for others. Left-wing governments saw it as an ally, right-wing ones as a threat. In the 1960s and 70s, Cuba actively supported guerrilla movements in Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, Argentina, Uruguay, Guatemala, and El Salvador. The results were catastrophic. Almost all of these movements suffered defeat, and their participants died or were imprisoned. The Cuban model of Foucaultismo, a theory according to which a small group of guerrillas could provoke a mass uprising, proved inapplicable in most Latin American contexts. Che Guevara's death in Bolivia became a symbol of this failure. In the 1970s, Latin American military regimes, inspired by anti-communist ideology and supported by the United States, launched large-scale repressions. Operation Condor, the secret coordination of the intelligence services of Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, and Bolivia, was directed, in part, against Cuban influence. Thousands were killed, tens of thousands imprisoned, and millions intimidated. In this context, Cuba became a refuge for the Latin American left, and this is another of its paradoxes. An island where internal opposition was suppressed provided sanctuary to opposition members from other countries. Colombian rebels, Chilean socialists, and Argentinian Montoneros found shelter and support in Cuba. For them, Cuba was a symbol of hope, even if the reality of Cuban life did not always match the ideals. In the 21st century, the pink tide in Latin America, the rise to power of left-wing governments in Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Uruguay gave Cuba new allies and partners. Chávez's Venezuela, as already mentioned, became the main economic patron. Miles Bolivia, Ortega's Nicaragua, and Correa's Ecuador. These governments supported Cuba in the international arena. But the pink tide proved unstable. Venezuela plunged into an economic and political crisis. Brazil shifted to the right. Argentina went left, then right, then left again unpredictably. Cuba was left with its own problems. Another aspect deserving of attention is Cuba's role in global healthcare. This is perhaps the most indisputable achievement of the revolution. Although even here, there are complexities and caveats. The Cuban medical system was built from scratch after the revolution. Before 1959, there were about 6,000 doctors in Cuba. Half of them emigrated in the first years after Castro came to power. Those who remained, together with new graduates of medical schools, created a system that became a model for developing countries. Universal free access, a focus on primary care, prevention, and public health. A family doctor in every block and village. The results were impressive. Infant mortality in Cuba is one of the lowest in the Americas, comparable to Canada and the United States. Life expectancy is higher than in most Latin American countries. Cuba was the first in the world to eliminate mother-to-child transmission of HIV. Cuban biotechnology created vaccines, anti-cancer drugs, and treatments for diabetic foot ulcers. Cuban doctors have worked and continue to work all over the world. In Africa, Latin America, Asia, and even in Europe after natural disasters. After the earthquake in Pakistan in 2005 and the Ebola epidemic in West Africa in 2001,415, Cuban medical brigades were among the first to arrive to help. But there is a flip side. Cuban doctors working abroad through state programs receive only a small fraction of what the host countries pay for their labor. The bulk of the sum goes to the Cuban government. This led to accusations of modern slavery and to lawsuits filed by defector doctors. Inside Cuba, the medical system degraded. Shortages of medicine, equipment, and motivation. The best doctors were leaving. Those who remained worked for meager wages in dilapidated hospitals. The phrase Cuba exports doctors, not bananas, sounded proud, but behind it lay a harsh reality. The country lived off the labor of its specialists, sending them into the world as it once sent sugar. Let us return to the question of change, or the lack thereof. Cuba, after the departure of both Castros from power, represents a system functioning by inertia. The Communist Party remains at the helm, but the ideological fire has gone out. Young functionaries, raised during the special period, are more pragmatic and cynical than their predecessors. They govern not for the sake of ideals, but for the preservation of the system and their own position within it. The military-industrial complex, GISA, controls the most profitable sectors of the economy: tourism, retail trade in foreign currency, imports, and part of the exports. This creates an oligarchic structure masked by revolutionary rhetoric. Cuban generals are not public billionaires like Russian oligarchs, but their control over economic resources is undeniable. The private sector is growing, but slowly and under the constant threat of regulation. Small entrepreneurs, quintapropistas, open restaurants, barbershops, and workshops, or rent rooms to tourists. They create jobs, pay taxes, and provide goods and services that the state cannot. But they exist in legal uncertainty. Rules change, permits are revoked, and the tax burden can become unbearable. The internet is a factor that the Cuban government perceives as both a necessity and a threat. It spread slowly but steadily. Mobile internet became available in 2018, and this changed the information space. Cubans gained access to social networks, independent media, and alternative sources of information. The protests of July 11, 2021 were largely coordinated through social networks, and that is precisely why the authorities shut down the internet. Independent journalism in Cuba is under constant pressure. Sites like Fortini Medio, founded by blogger Juan Sanchez, Altoque, and Cubanet, operate from abroad or illegally. Their authors are subject to persecution. State media remains a monopoly of the airwaves, though fewer people watch them, preferring El Paquete Semanal, a weekly selection of entertainment content, downloaded from flash drives and distributed illegally. Cultural life, despite all the restrictions, maintains a surprising vitality. Reggaeton, a genre that the Cuban authorities long tried to suppress as immoral, has become the dominant form of youth music. Hip-hop, electronic music, and independent rap, all of this exists, often in a semi-underground mode. Young artists use performance, installations, and street art to express what cannot be said in words. Literature continues to be created on the island, in the diaspora, and on the border between them. Cuban cinematography, despite all its financial difficulties, occasionally produces films that gain international recognition. Animation, documentaries, and short films. In these formats, Cuban authors find space for expression. Religion in modern Cuba is experiencing a revival. After decades of state atheism, formal discrimination against believers continued until the 1990s. When restrictions were eased, the Catholic Church regained some of its influence, especially after the visit of Pope John Paul II in 1998, which became a historic event. Protestant churches, especially evangelical ones, are growing rapidly, but the most widespread form of religiosity remains Santeria, a syncretic cult whose roots go back to the African Yoruba tradition. Santeria in modern Cuba is more than a religion. It is a cultural practice, a social network, a system of mutual aid, and a source of identity. Toque ceremonies, caminos initiations, and consultations with Babalawo priests are part of the daily lives of millions of Cubans, regardless of their race or social status. Foreign tourists come to Cuba specifically to undergo initiation, and religious tourism has become a distinct niche in the economy. It is time to gradually bring our narrative to a close, but first, a few more touches. Cuba is not only politics and economics, it is nature. The coral reefs surrounding the island are among the best preserved in the Caribbean, largely due to the absence of industrial pollution and mass coastal construction. The paradox of economic backwardness. Poverty proved to be a better protector of ecosystems than any environmental laws. Cuban mangrove forests, which in other Caribbean countries were cut down for hotels and beaches, have been preserved in Cuba. Chinagua de Zapata National Park, the largest wetland in the Caribbean, is home to the Cuban crocodile, the Cuban macaw, and many other endemic species. It is a place of impossible beauty. Tropical forest turning into mangroves, turning into a turquoise sea. Dozens of bird species, including the toady, the Cuban trogon, and the bee hummingbird, the smallest bird in the world, fill the air with sounds that have not changed for millennia. Cuban cuisine is another aspect deserving mention. It is simple: black beans, fried plantains, pork, yucca. But in this simplicity, there is its own perfection. Moros y Cristianos, rice and black beans, a dish whose name refers to the wars between Moors and Christians in Spain. Ropa vieja, stewed beef with vegetables, literally old clothes, named so for the appearance of the meat tearing into fibers. Mojitos and daiquiris, cocktails that Hemingway, who lived in Havana from 1939 to 1960, helped make famous throughout the world. Hemingway in Cuba is a story in itself. He lived in the Finca Vega estate near Havana, went fishing, drank in the bars Bodeguita del Medio and Al Floridita, and wrote The Old Man and the Sea Here, the novella for which he received the Nobel Prize. After the revolution, he supported Castro for a while. The two men met at a fishing tournament in 1960, but he soon left Cuba and committed suicide a year later in Idaho. His house near Havana has been turned into a museum. His ghost, if you believe Havana bartenders, still orders a daiquiri. But let us return from the bars to history. What remains of the Cuban Revolution in the 21st century? If you remove the ideology, propaganda, and myths from both sides, what do we see? We see a country that conducted a grand experiment, an attempt to build a just society on a small tropical island, 90 miles from the most powerful nation in the world, under conditions of an economic blockade with limited resources and enormous ambitions. The experiment yielded real results in education, healthcare, racial equality, and international solidarity. It also led to real victims: the suppression of freedom, economic stagnation, mass emigration, and the destruction of civil society. We see a people who displayed striking resilience, surviving in conditions that would have broken many. Cubans joke, play music, dance, fall in love, raise children, bury their elderly, fix old cars, brew coffee from peas, and look at the sea from the Malecon parapet. And they do all this with a dignity that does not depend on the political system. We see an island that occupies a place in the global imagination disproportionate to its size and population: Cuba, an idea, a myth, a projection of others' desires and fears. For everyone, it means something of its own, and none of these meanings encompass the whole. The history of Cuba is a history of paradoxes, an island freed from one dependency only to fall into another. A revolution that gave freedom from inequality, but took away freedom of speech. A nation scattered across the world, but not having lost its connection to the homeland. A culture flourishing in conditions of poverty. The utopia that became a bureaucracy unable to kill hope. And even as you listen to these words, somewhere in Havana an old man sits on a porch and watches the sunset. The light becomes golden, then orange, then purple. The clouds over the Florida Straits catch the last light of the day. Music drifts from somewhere. Maybe an old song, maybe a new reggaeton. Children play in the street. A woman hangs laundry. A man carries home a loaf of bread, bought with a ration card. All of this is Cuba. Neither an idea, nor a myth, nor a symbol. A living place, living people. A living history that continues slowly, with difficulty, stubbornly, like the waves breaking against the stones of the Malecon. The same waves for 500 years, the same stones, different people, but with the same look toward the horizon. The shadows lengthen, the air warms and thickens. The evening tropical air, smelling of the sea, gasoline, fried onions, and blooming jasmine. The lanterns turn on if there is electricity, if not, only the stars. The stars over the Caribbean Sea, bright, large, indifferent to politics, economics, and ideologies. Under these stars, the Talos slept in their hammocks. Under these stars, Spanish soldiers stood on the walls of El Morro, peering into the sea in search of enemy sails. Under these stars, slaves sang songs in languages they were forbidden to forget. Under these stars, José dreamed of a free Cuba. Under these stars, the bearded guerrillas descended from the mountains. Under these stars, nuclear missiles stood at launch positions, ready to destroy the world. Under these stars, families on rafts made of inner tubes crossed the Florida Straits, hoping for another life. The stars have not changed, the island has not changed. It is the same, a narrow strip of land between the Atlantic and the Caribbean Sea, with mountains in the east, plains in the west, beaches, mangroves, rivers, and forests. Only the people and the stories they tell have changed. This story is one of them, not complete, not final, not the only true one, simply an attempt to trace the thread stretching through 5 centuries. From the first tonneau canoes to the last emigrant planes, from the gold of conquistadors to the sugar of planters, from the grito de oro to the cry of libertad on the streets of Havana in 2021, Cuba remains an unfinished sentence, a story whose finale has not yet been written, a utopia that did not come true, but was also not finally rejected by an island that begins over again, time and again, and now, as night descends on the Caribbean and a warm breeze stirs the palm leaves, you can allow your thoughts to slow down. The waves wash onto the shore, recede, and wash in again. This rhythm is older than any revolution, older than any empire, any utopia. It will continue when all ideologies are forgotten, when all leaders become portraits on walls and then lines in textbooks, when the sugar plantations are overgrown and the fortresses turn back to stone. But until that happens, while the island lives, while its people laugh, sing, argue, leave, and return, Cuba continues to ask the world questions to which the world has no answers. Is it possible to build a just society? At what cost? Who has the right to decide for others? What is more important, equality or freedom? Is it possible to have both? These questions do not go away. They remain, as the island remains in its place between 2 Americas, between 2 oceans, between the past and the future. Allow yourself to close your eyes. Imagine the warm wind, the smell of the sea, the distant sound of a trumpet. Imagine Havana at night, dark, quiet, beautiful, and fall asleep with this image, knowing that tomorrow the story will continue. But for now, there is only the night, only the sea, only the stars. If this story helped you relax and learn something new, subscribe to the channel and give it a like. It will help us create more stories like this for your evenings. Good night.